In Victorian Scotland, beneath the glow of gaslight and the silence of locked doors, a young woman's love letters became weapons, and a glass of cocoa may have carried death itself. This is the story of passion, poison, and a verdict that refused to decide. It began, as so many tragedies do, with a chance encounter that set two lives on a collision course neither could escape. Glasgow in the mid-1850s was a city in transition, its streets crowded with merchants, clerks, and the rising middle class, all chasing fortune in the industrial boom. But in the midst of this progress, beneath the gaslight and behind the high windows of townhouses, lay secrets of longing, ambition, and betrayal. Pierre Emile L'Angelier was not born to privilege. He had fashioned himself into a man of refinement, or at least the appearance of one. A clerk by trade, a dreamer by inclination, he carried himself with the air of a gentleman, though his salary betrayed the illusion. His accent, a lilting trace of French from his family roots in Jersey, lent him a certain exotic charm in the eyes of young women who longed for romance beyond the dull predictability of arranged introductions and polite dances. Yet behind the polished boots and the twirled mustache was a man troubled. Emile had already tasted disappointment in love. Twice he had been promised marriage, and twice he had been abandoned for men of better means. These blows had left scars not easily seen in public but evident in his darker moods. Friends spoke of his impulsive nature, of nights when despair drove him to the brink of ending his own life, only to be pulled back by the arm of a companion or the weight of guilt. It was perhaps this mixture of vulnerability and bravado that made him so compelling to certain women. He seemed worldly, tragic, and gallant all at once. A dangerous cocktail for a young woman raised in the sheltered drawing rooms of Glasgow's upper middle class. Madeleine Hamilton Smith was such a woman. The daughter of James Smith, a respected architect who had risen from humble beginnings to the heights of Victorian society, Madeleine lived a life bounded by expectation. Educated at a finishing school in London, she returned to Glasgow prepared for the role her parents had chosen for her: to marry advantageously, to strengthen family ties, to maintain the fragile edifice of social respectability that her father had so carefully constructed. But Madeleine was not so easily contained. She was spirited, curious, and impatient with the suffocating propriety of her class. To her, the prospect of being matched with some balding widower or pompous young man of means was intolerable. She longed for excitement, for passion, for something that felt like life rather than duty. When she met Emile, by chance, in the bustle of a Glasgow street, her world shifted. He was unlike the young men of her circle, older, attentive, and bold in his charm. He bowed with a flourish, kissed her hand with confidence, and looked at her not as a bargaining chip in a family alliance but as a woman. It thrilled her. For Emile, the attraction was instant and calculated. He recognized in Madeleine not only beauty and vivacity but opportunity. Here was the daughter of a man of stature, a young woman whose very presence at his side would elevate his own standing. To win her affection was to grasp at the respectability and position that had always eluded him. And yet, beyond ambition, there was genuine desire. Her laughter, her impulsive remarks, her very disregard for social caution. All of it drew him in. They began to meet in secret. At first, the encounters were innocent enough. Walks in the park, a few stolen minutes at gatherings, letters passed with trembling excitement. But secrecy has a way of intensifying passion. The very act of concealment made each word, each glance, more electric. Soon, their correspondence grew fevered, filled with declarations of love, promises of devotion, and the language of bodies as well as hearts. Victorian society was merciless to women who strayed from its rigid codes. For Madeleine, every note she wrote, every meeting she agreed to, was a step onto a dangerous path. Yet she could not resist. The thrill of defiance, the intoxication of forbidden romance, outweighed the voice of caution. For Emile, the letters were more than tokens of affection. They became a weapon, a collection of her words that bound her to him. Over time, he would guard them with the cunning of a man who knew their value, letters that could ruin her reputation if revealed. It was an unspoken power, and it would one day hang like a shadow over their love. But in those early days, neither thought of ruin. They thought only of each other, of stolen kisses, of whispered promises, of a love that seemed to defy the rigid world around them. They believed, or at least Madeleine believed, that somehow, someway, they could bridge the gulf between class and expectation. What neither of them could see was how fragile their world was, how quickly passion could turn to poison, and how their story would become one of the most notorious trials of the Victorian age. The affair between Emile and Madeleine did not unfold in the open air of polite society, but in shadows and margins. Theirs was a romance conducted in hurried notes, smuggled into unsuspecting hands by sympathetic servants, in brief encounters disguised as errands, in stolen moments beneath the gas lamps of Sauchiehall Street. Every detail of their secret meetings was colored by danger. In the world Madeleine inhabited, even the suspicion of impropriety could destroy a young woman's reputation forever. A whisper was enough to close doors, to end a family's ambitions for her marriage, to stain her name beyond recovery. But the very danger only sharpened her desire. She thrilled at the thought that she, the obedient daughter of a stern architect, was capable of such rebellion. Emile, for his part, stoked this thrill. He wrote letters filled with ardor, daring her to defy convention, urging her to prove her devotion with words and gestures more binding than she had ever imagined herself giving. At first, Madeleine responded with girlish innocence, shy phrases of love and longing, romantic declarations influenced by the poetry she read at school. But soon her tone shifted. She wrote with fire, with urgency, with the boldness of a woman discovering both passion and power. Historians who later read those letters would marvel at their intimacy. For a young Victorian woman of her class, the language was astonishing, tender, yes, but also frank in its physical desire. She spoke of belonging to him, of giving herself to him entirely, of yearning for the day they might be together without concealment. These were not the cautious words of a debutante, but the unguarded confessions of a woman intoxicated by love. To Emile, each page was treasure and insurance. He kept them all. Bound together, those letters were not just expressions of devotion. They were a chain that bound Madeleine to him. He knew their value. In a society where a woman's virtue was prized above all else, such words, if revealed, could ruin her utterly. Whether he intended from the beginning to use them as leverage, or whether that thought crept in only later, is difficult to say. But he understood the power they gave him, and that understanding would shape everything that followed. Their encounters grew bolder. On evenings when the Smith family believed her safely at home, Madeleine would steal out, cloaked and trembling, to meet Emile. He would walk her through the quiet streets, or sometimes lead her to his lodgings, where the intimacy of their letters became flesh and blood. It was dangerous, reckless, intoxicating, and it bound them tighter than ever. But secrecy weighs heavily. For every moment of rapture, there was a moment of fear. The fear of discovery haunted Madeleine. Servants whispered. Neighbors watched. She knew her father would never forgive her if he learned of her meetings with a man so far beneath her in social rank. And yet she could not stop. Each attempt to pull away only drew her back with greater force. Emile's temperament made the affair all the more volatile. Charming in company, he could be moody in private, given to sudden fits of melancholy or flashes of temper. His friends had long noticed this dual nature, the jovial raconteur one moment, the brooding pessimist the next. Madeleine, caught in the storm of first love, mistook these moods for depth, for the sign of a tortured soul who needed her devotion to steady him. But in truth, they were warning signs. As months passed, Emile began to press for more time, more commitment, more proof that she would not abandon him as others had. His insecurity was like a wound that never healed. He had been jilted before, twice promised marriage and twice left behind for men of better fortune. The thought of losing Madeleine filled him with dread, and that dread turned to suspicion, then to demands. At times he threatened to expose their relationship if she drew back. He reminded her of the letters, of the words she had written in moments of passion. words that could destroy her if they reached her father's eyes. Whether he intended to make good on such threats, or whether they were the desperate cries of a man afraid of abandonment, no one can say. But Madeleine felt the pressure keenly. What had begun as exhilarating freedom now showed its darker side. Still, she clung to him. For all his volatility, Emile gave her something she had never felt before. The sense of being truly seen, truly desired. In a world where young women were paraded like wares at market, valued for dowries and connections, she found in him the illusion of choice, of passion, of agency. She was not ready to surrender it. The city itself seemed to conspire with their secrecy. Glasgow, with its fog-shrouded streets and crowded tenements, offered hiding places aplenty. Gaslight flickered on wet cobblestones. The sound of carriage wheels masked hurried footsteps, and the anonymity of the growing metropolis provided cover for two lovers playing a dangerous game. Yet the same city, with its gossiping neighbors and rigid hierarchies, ensured that discovery was always a breath away. By the end of 1855, their relationship was no longer the innocent romance of stolen glances. It had become a binding entanglement, one that neither could easily escape. She, caught between duty to her family and devotion to her lover. He, determined not to be abandoned again, clutching her letters as both tokens of love and weapons of survival. It was a story already teetering on the edge of tragedy, though neither could see it fully. To them, the world was still a stage for their defiance, a place where passion might conquer class, where love might overcome expectation. They had yet to grasp that in Victorian society, passion could be as deadly as poison, and in their case it soon would be. By the spring of 1856, the affair between Madeleine Hamilton Smith and Pierre Emile L'Angelier had reached a fever pitch. What began as excitement and stolen kisses had deepened into something heavier, more binding, and far more dangerous. Their secret meetings were no longer just diversions. They were necessities, each encounter charged with the desperation of people who knew their time together was borrowed. The correspondence between them had swelled to hundreds of letters. Each page carried not just words of affection, but promises, confessions, even reckless declarations that blurred the line between love and possession. For Madeleine, the letters were a release, an outlet for feelings she could not express at home, where her father's stern presence and her mother's delicate constitution left little space for rebellion. For Emile, the letters were proof, binding evidence that she was his, heart and body. But as the months wore on, the relationship began to tilt. The imbalance between them, in age, in class, in circumstance, grew more apparent. Madeleine's world was structured, with suitors quietly presented to her family, with expectations of marriage within her circle. Emile's world was precarious, a clerk's wage, a rented room, and a reputation that depended on his ability to impress. He knew he had little to offer her in the eyes of society, and so he clung to her words, to the letters where she called herself his wife, his only love, his everything. When she wavered, he reminded her of those letters, sometimes tenderly, sometimes with the sharp edge of warning. "You belong to me," he would say. "You have told me so in your own hand. Do you think you can take it back?" For a young woman raised in the codes of Victorian respectability, such reminders were as binding as iron. Yet doubt crept into Madeleine's heart. She began to see not only the romance but the risk. Emile could be charming, but he could also be demanding, even cruel in his suspicions. He questioned her every absence, every delay in her replies. His jealousy flared at imagined rivals, and his accusations grew sharper. What had once thrilled her now sometimes frightened her. At home, her father pressed her toward more suitable matches. Men of standing with names and fortunes to match. She found them dull, pompous, even distasteful, but their presence was a constant reminder of the life her family expected her to lead. The contrast between the safety of that path and the danger of her secret weighed on her. Still, she could not let Emile go. Love and fear, desire and dread, bound her too tightly. The secrecy of their meetings only heightened the intensity. On nights when she slipped from her house, heart pounding, to meet him under cover of darkness, the very risk fueled their passion. Every embrace seemed stolen from fate, every kiss a rebellion. Yet each time, she returned home with the weight of guilt pressing heavier on her shoulders. By summer, cracks in their bond widened. She began to resent his demands, his endless need for reassurance. He, in turn, sensed her wavering and clutched harder. He spoke of marriage, of eloping, of binding her to him forever. She hesitated, knowing full well her father would never consent, knowing too that Emile's prospects could never match her family's ambitions. It was during this time that the first whispers of poison entered their story. In Victorian households, arsenic was common, sold openly by chemists for killing rats, for polishing, even in certain medicinal concoctions. Women whispered that in small doses it could improve the complexion, lend the skin a fashionable pallor. Stories circulated of peasants in Austria and France who ate arsenic as a tonic, building tolerance, using it to climb mountains with greater endurance. Madeleine heard these stories too. To her, arsenic was not yet a weapon, but a curiosity, an oddity of science, a symbol of both beauty and danger. But to Emile, who had long claimed to dabble with such substances, arsenic carried darker connotations. He spoke of it casually, as though it were a familiar companion. Whether in jest or in earnest, his references to poison would soon take on a chilling resonance. As autumn approached, the lovers found themselves trapped in a cycle of passion and quarrel. They wrote feverishly, met secretly, reconciled dramatically, only to fall again into suspicion and anger. For outsiders, their love affair might have seemed doomed by the most obvious barrier, class. But the true doom lay within, in Emile's growing sense of possession, in Madeleine's fear of entrapment, and in the letters that bound them like chains. The year wore on, and with it the sweetness of their early days began to sour. What had once been thrilling for Madeleine was now edged with unease. She had discovered in Emile a man of contradictions, attentive and gallant one moment, brooding and suspicious the next. He demanded more of her than she could give. Not merely her time, not merely her affection, but her entire future. When she faltered, when she hesitated to speak of marriage, or when she recoiled at his intensity, Emile turned the conversation to the letters. They were his shield and his sword. "You are mine, Madeleine," he would whisper. "And I can prove it. In your hand you have sworn it. No father, no mother, no friend can deny what you have written." It was not always spoken as a threat. Sometimes it came as a reassurance, as though he believed her written words were talismans against abandonment. But to Madeleine, the meaning was clear. She had given him power over her, and he knew it. The power weighed on her more heavily with each passing week. In her father's house, talk of suitors filled the air. James Smith had worked too hard, risen too far from his beginnings as a crofter's son, to see his daughter cast away her future on a clerk with no fortune and no family name. He had ambitions for Madeleine, ambitions she now knew she could never meet without betraying Emile, and yet to stay with Emile was its own betrayal of family, of duty, of the future that had been laid before her since birth. In letters, she tried to soothe him. She wrote of love, of promises, of the day they would be together openly. She swore she was his body and soul, and in those moments she believed it, for her passion was genuine, her rebellion sincere. But almost as soon as the ink dried, the doubts returned. She loved him, but did she trust him? She longed for him. But could she truly see herself as his wife, living in a modest lodging house, estranged from family and friends, cut adrift from the world she knew? Emile, sensing her ambivalence, grew sharper. He accused her of faithlessness, of coldness, of entertaining other men. His jealousy became a constant undertone, and when she protested her innocence, he turned again to the letters. "If you leave me," he told her, "if you betray me as others have, I will go to your father. I will place these letters in his hands. Then we shall see what becomes of you." For Madeleine, the words were a dagger. She could picture the look on her father's face, the ruin of her mother's fragile health, the whispers of society that would brand her forever. A woman's honor, in her world, was everything. To lose it was to lose all respect, position, future. and she had entrusted her honor to a man who now wielded it as a weapon. Still, she could not let him go. The bond was too strong, the thrill too intoxicating. Again and again, she forgave him, soothed him, reconciled with him. The cycle of quarrel and passion tightened its grip. In Glasgow, the gossip of acquaintances began to stir. Whispers of the foreign clerk with his bold manners, seen walking late with a young lady too fine for his station. Nothing explicit, nothing certain, but enough to send a ripple of unease through Madeleine's circle. She felt eyes upon her at gatherings, noticed the way conversations faltered when she entered the room. Her nerves frayed. She was restless at home, sharp with her sisters, withdrawn at family dinners. Her mother, already frail, asked what troubled her. Her father demanded to know why she looked so pale. She lied with practiced ease, but the strain showed. Only when she slipped away to meet Emile did she feel release, though even then it was mingled with fear. And Emile, ever mercurial, added to that fear. He spoke sometimes of illness, of pains in his stomach, of ailments that seemed to pass as suddenly as they appeared. He mentioned arsenic in conversation, with a strange mixture of casualness and gravity. He boasted of its effects on complexion, on strength, as though poison were an old companion. Whether he spoke truth or exaggeration, Madeleine could not always tell. But the word lodged in her mind, arsenic. A substance common enough to be purchased from any chemist, yet deadly in the wrong hands. By winter, their relationship was at a breaking point. He pressed harder for commitment. She grew more desperate for a way out. To end it meant exposure, scandal, ruin. To remain meant surrender. A marriage to a man she was beginning to fear as much as she loved. And so she lived in limbo, torn between two impossible choices. Each letter she wrote bound her tighter. Each quarrel drove her further toward despair. Theirs was no longer the romance of youthful rebellion. It had become a struggle for power, a battle of wills, a dangerous game in which both had too much to lose. No one around them could have guessed that their clandestine love affair, hidden behind lace curtains and locked drawers, would soon erupt into one of the most infamous murder trials of Victorian Britain. But already the storm was gathering. Already, the poison of suspicion had entered their hearts. And soon, poison of another kind would follow. The Smith household in Blythswood Square bustled with activity that winter. James Smith, ever the ambitious architect, had no intention of seeing his eldest daughter waste her youth on frivolity. At 19, Madeleine was of marriageable age, and her parents discussed suitors with increasing urgency. There was talk of respectable young men with connections, of prosperous merchants' sons, of gentlemen whose fortunes were well established. They were men Madeleine was expected to receive graciously, to entertain at family gatherings, to consider with an eye toward future alliances. She found them all insufferable. Their conversation was dull, their manners practiced, their ambitions transparent. They looked at her not as a person but as a prize, a symbol of her father's success. In secret, she compared them to Emile. For all his faults, and she was beginning to see them clearly, he was attentive, passionate, alive. He spoke to her as if she mattered. He pressed her hand, whispered promises, swore that she was the center of his world. No merchant's son could rival that intensity. And yet, Emile's love was no longer a refuge. It was becoming a trap. At every meeting, his jealousy sharpened. He accused her of entertaining other men, of betraying him in thought if not in deed. He pored over her words, demanding reassurance, demanding proof. And when her patience wore thin, when she dared suggest that their relationship had become impossible, he turned to his cache of letters. "You are mine, Madeleine," he hissed one night, clutching a bundle of pages close to his chest. "Do not forget what you have written me. If you cast me aside, I will not go quietly. I will show them all what their precious daughter has been. And then where will you be? Where will your family be?" The words chilled her. He had never sounded more dangerous, more determined to hold her by force if not by love. She pleaded with him, begged him to burn the letters, to trust her. But he only shook his head, a bitter smile playing at his lips. "No," he said softly, almost tenderly. "They are my proof. My guarantee that you will not betray me as others have. Twice I have been abandoned. Twice I have been made a fool. You will not be the third. She left that night with her heart in turmoil. What had begun as a rebellion against her father's authority was now a chain around her own neck. She could not bring herself to sever it, but neither could she endure it. At home, the pressure mounted. Her father spoke openly of marriage, dropping hints with increasing force. One name in particular surfaced again and again. William Minnick, a wealthy merchant's son, steady, respectable, and precisely the kind of man James Smith desired for his daughter. Madeleine met him with politeness, but her heart was not in it. Still, the contrast between Minnick's promise of stability and Emile's volatile passion gnawed at her. She began to wonder, what if she could be free of Emile? What if she could wipe the slate clean, destroy the letters, and step into the life her family demanded of her? But freedom was not so easily won. Emile had no intention of letting her go. His letters grew more urgent, his demands more insistent. He pressed her for secret meetings, threatened exposure when she hesitated. Each day, she lived in fear of discovery, watching her father's stern face at the dinner table, dreading the moment when a letter might fall into his hands. In her diary, if indeed she kept one, she might have written of her despair. But the record we have are the letters themselves. Letters that reveal a young woman caught in a tightening snare, her words vacillating between devotion and desperation. At times, she swore undying love. At others, she hinted at the impossibility of their union. To Emile, every hesitation was betrayal. To Madeleine, every demand was another turn of the screw. And all the while, the whispers of poison returned. Emile's health seemed to falter in strange intervals. He spoke of stomach pains, of sudden weakness, only to recover swiftly. He attributed it to food, to drink, to his own delicate constitution. But he also spoke, with a curious pride, of his tolerance for substances that would fell other men. He mentioned arsenic again, laughing as though it were an old friend. To Madeleine, the word took on a strange fascination. Arsenic was everywhere in Victorian life, in wallpapers, in cosmetics, in rat poison sold over the counter. Its presence was both ordinary and deadly. She had heard maids whisper of its effects on complexion, of women who took it in small doses to keep their skin pale and smooth. She herself had once mused aloud about its use, though more in girlish curiosity than in earnest intent. Now, the idea lingered in her mind with darker implications. For the first time, the possibility of an escape began to take form. Not yet a plan, not yet a decision, but a thought. What if there were a way to silence Emile? What if the threat of exposure could be ended once and for all? It was a dangerous thought, but in the mind of a young woman cornered by passion, duty, and fear, dangerous thoughts were becoming unavoidable. As 1856 gave way to 1857, the affair had shifted into something neither lover could fully control. What began as stolen glances and whispered vows had hardened into a struggle of fear, possession, and desperation. Emile L'Angelier was no longer content with promises. He demanded action. "Marry me, Madeleine," he pressed again and again. "You have pledged yourself. You have sworn to me in your letters. Do you think you can deny me now?" But Madeleine had seen another path. William Minnick, steady and well-positioned, began to call at the Smith house with growing regularity. He was everything her father desired in a son-in-law: respectable, prosperous, rooted in Glasgow's mercantile class. His presence made clear what her family expected, and what her future could be, if only she could be free. To Emile, this was betrayal of the highest order. His suspicions, long simmering, burst into fury. He wrote letters filled with accusation, demanding to know if she had grown cold, if she intended to discard him for another. And when her answers failed to reassure him, he laid bare the threat he had long held in reserve. "If you leave me, Madeleine," he wrote, "I shall show your letters to your father. He will know the truth. All will know the truth. And then what will become of you?" It was blackmail in all but name. He did not need to demand money. He demanded her. Her reputation, her family's honor, her very future hung in the balance. The letters she had once written in the flush of passion had become chains, each page a weapon that could ruin her forever. For Madeleine, the terror was suffocating. She began to dread his handwriting on the envelopes that arrived in secret, to tremble at the thought of him appearing uninvited at her family's door. She had given him her words, her body, her trust, and he now wielded them as a cudgel. And yet, even as she recoiled, she could not wholly break away. The hold of first love, of passion once intoxicating, lingered still. She met him again, pleaded with him to burn the letters, promised him affection she no longer truly felt, if only to keep his anger at bay. But the more she tried to soothe him, the tighter he clung. At the same time, her father's plans advanced. William Minnick was more than a possibility. He was becoming an expectation. The family spoke of him with approval, dropping hints that grew ever less subtle. To James Smith, his daughter's marriage was not a matter of romance but of alliance, respectability, and the consolidation of social standing he had fought to achieve. Madeleine stood at a crossroads. On one side, the steady respectability of Minnick, with her family's blessing and a secure future. On the other, the volatile passion of Emile, now poisoned by jealousy and threats. And she knew she could not walk both paths. It was then that the thought of poison, once a curiosity, began to crystallize into possibility. She knew of arsenic's presence in apothecaries, of its sale in small paper packets for pennies. She knew it could be obtained under the guise of killing vermin, of household necessity. And she knew, too, of its deadliness. The first steps were tentative. She inquired in passing about remedies, listened to gossip of complexion tonics, remembered Emile's boasts of taking arsenic without harm. But the thought grew in her mind, persistent and dark. Poison as escape, poison as silence, poison as the end to a trap that seemed otherwise inescapable. Friends and family saw only fragments of her turmoil. They noticed her pallor, her distracted air, her sudden fits of temper followed by melancholy. To them, she was a young woman on the threshold of marriage, nervous perhaps, but hardly extraordinary. None suspected the storm raging beneath the surface, the fear of exposure, the weight of blackmail, the dangerous thought that her only path to freedom lay in a chemist's vial. By early 1857, the trajectory was set. Emile grew ever more insistent, his threats more pointed. Madeleine, caught between a father's expectations and a lover's demands, felt the walls closing in. In her mind, there was no way forward that did not end in ruin, unless she took matters into her own hands. The whispers of poison were no longer just whispers. They were becoming intent. The chemist's shop on Sauchiehall Street looked ordinary enough. To passers-by, it was little more than another storefront in a city swelling with commerce. Shelves lined with bottles, jars labeled in Latin, powders and tonics dispensed with brisk efficiency. But behind the polished counters lay substances of extraordinary power, available to anyone who knew the right words to ask. In Victorian Britain, poisons were both commonplace and concealed. Arsenic, strychnine, laudanum, each was sold openly. Their dangers acknowledged but their presence accepted as part of daily life. Arsenic in particular was everywhere. It was in rat poison, in dyes, in wallpaper that gleamed a brilliant green, even in cosmetics whispered to improve the skin. To purchase it required little more than a name in a register, a polite request for vermin control. A chemist might ask a question or two, but seldom more. Respectable ladies could obtain it as readily as housemaids, each packet folded neatly in white paper, each grain of the white powder carrying the promise of death. It was into such a shop that Madeleine Hamilton Smith ventured, her bonnet drawn low, her heart racing beneath layers of silk and lace. She asked in careful tones for arsenic, citing the need to deal with rats at her family's country house. The chemist, accustomed to such requests, obliged without hesitation. He asked her name for the ledger. She gave it. A small paper packet was placed into her gloved hand. Nothing in the exchange betrayed the turmoil beneath her calm exterior. At home, the packet remained hidden. Whether she stared at it in fear, or whether she tested it, we cannot know. But what is certain is that within days, Emile L'Angelier began to complain of sudden, violent illness. He described to friends searing pains in his stomach, waves of nausea that left him doubled over, thirst that no water could quench. The attacks came and went, sudden in onset, dramatic in force, then subsiding just enough to allow recovery. Each time he rallied, he insisted to his companions that he had been poisoned. "I believe someone has tried to do me harm," he confided. "It is in my food, my drink. I am sure of it." His friends dismissed it at first, attributing the symptoms to spoiled food, to weak digestion. But Emile clung to the idea. He spoke of arsenic specifically, as if the word itself haunted him. Whether he suspected Madeleine then, or whether the thought came later, is unclear. But the coincidence was ominous. Meanwhile, Madeleine's world grew ever more precarious. Her engagement to Minnick was quietly solidifying. Her family, pleased with the match, spoke of it with confidence. Yet Emile's letters continued to arrive, filled with threats and pleas in equal measure. He demanded meetings, swore he would expose her if she deserted him, reminded her of her promises, her words, her body given to him in secret. To manage both men required a balancing act worthy of the stage. To Minnick, she was the dutiful daughter, charming and compliant, ready to step into the role of wife with grace. To Emile, she was still his devoted lover, writing words of affection she no longer fully felt, attending clandestine meetings under cover of night. Each role was a mask, and beneath them both she trembled. And all the while, the small packets of arsenic passed through chemists' hands into hers. She signed her name in ledgers that would one day become evidence in a courtroom, each entry a step closer to disaster. In the city's drawing rooms, no one suspected. Conversations turned to opera, to politics, to the latest news from abroad. But behind the gaslit windows, a drama was unfolding that would soon shock all of Britain. A young woman of good family was walking a path toward an act unthinkable, the murder of her lover by poison. At least that was how it would appear. Whether Madeleine truly intended it, whether she carried out the act or whether fate conspired another way, would be the question that haunted the trial. But in the spring of 1857, the pieces were already in place. The arsenic, the letters, the threats, the illnesses. The stage was set. Emile L'Angelier's friends began to notice the pattern. He would arrive at work or at his lodgings in apparently good health, only to be struck down suddenly, gripped by violent pain in his stomach, retching until he was too weak to stand. His complexion grew pale, his eyes hollow. Then, just as suddenly, he would rally, insisting that he had been poisoned but refusing to seek a doctor's advice beyond the most perfunctory remedies. Some dismissed his talk as melodrama. Emile had always been prone to exaggeration, weaving stories of his exploits in France, of dangers faced and triumphs won. But others could not ignore the severity of his attacks. The timing, too, raised questions. The worst episodes often followed late-night meetings with Madeleine. He spoke of this himself. "I believe she has given me something," he confided to a colleague, half in sorrow, half in defiance. "If I die, it will be by her hand." Yet even as he said it, he returned to her, unable or unwilling to sever the bond. His obsession bound him as surely as her fear bound her. Meanwhile, Madeleine's visits to chemists continued. In registers still preserved, her name appeared again and again, each entry carefully written in the hand of a young woman who could scarcely have imagined how damning those pages would one day become. She asked for arsenic in small quantities, each time providing explanations for vermin, for cosmetic use, for the household. The chemists obliged, with little more than a raised brow. Arsenic was too common, too ordinary, to arouse more than passing notice. But in the privacy of her room, what did she think as she unwrapped the little paper packets? Did she tremble at the thought of their power? Did she measure them out, test them, perhaps mix them into powders or liquids with a shaking hand? Or did she merely hide them away, the weight of the decision pressing on her without yet being acted upon? History cannot say with certainty. What is known is that Emile's illnesses grew worse. At the Smith household, the talk of Minnick's proposal reached a quiet crescendo. James Smith, stern and proud, pressed his daughter to consider the match. It would secure her future, protect the family's standing, and fulfill the expectations of society. For Madeleine, the proposal was both lifeline and trap. A marriage to Minnick meant escape from Emile, from his threats, from the letters. But it also meant betrayal, for Emile would not be silent. He had made that abundantly clear. She tried, in her own way, to disentangle herself. Her letters to Emile began to cool, though they still carried enough affection to keep him tethered. She avoided some meetings, delayed others. Yet she could not bring herself to end it outright. His hold on her was too strong, his threats too sharp. And so the cycle continued. Clandestine meetings under cover of night, followed by violent illness. Emile's cries of poison, met with shrugs or uneasy laughter. Madeleine's purchases of arsenic, noted dutifully in chemists' ledgers. Two lives spinning faster and faster toward collision. Friends and acquaintances looked on with little understanding. To them, Emile was a man beset by stomach troubles, perhaps worsened by his own vanity and self-medicating habits. To them, Madeleine was a young woman courted by a respectable suitor, her future apparently secure. None could see the truth, that beneath the calm exterior of Victorian propriety, a storm was raging that would soon break in scandal and tragedy. By March of 1857, the strain was unbearable. Emile was pale, hollow-cheeked, yet still clung to his passion. Madeleine was exhausted, pulled between the safety of Minnick and the terror of Emile. And in her possession, or at least within her reach, was the most feared substance of her age, arsenic. The pieces were in place. The letters, the poison, the illnesses, the suitor, the threats. All that remained was the fatal night when it would all come crashing down. The winter of 1857 gave way to a bleak, damp March in Glasgow. The city's streets, slick with rain, were filled with the clatter of carriages and the glow of gas lamps against the mist. But in one small lodging house on Blythswood Square, the drama of Emile L'Angelier's life reached its fatal crescendo. In the days before his death, Emile was restless. He spoke to friends of meetings with Madeleine that left him drained and sick. He confided to some that he had been poisoned, that he feared she meant to do him harm, and yet he could not stay away. The very woman he suspected was the woman he longed for, the one he believed he could not live without. On March 22nd, he received a note from her. Its words, though later debated in court, invited him once more to meet her at her family's house, under the cover of darkness, while her parents slept. Whether she truly intended to see him, or whether the note was one of many tangled threads in their correspondence, will never be known with certainty. What is certain is that Emile, clutching the promise of her words, left his lodgings that night and walked into the cold Glasgow air. He arrived at her street around 10 o'clock, but what passed after remains shrouded in mystery. Some say he was admitted to her presence, that she received him in secret as she had so many times before. Others argue he never gained entry, that he lingered outside in the damp night, waiting in vain. Madeleine herself, later questioned, would deny that she saw him. What is beyond dispute is that in the early hours of March 23rd, Emile staggered back to his lodging house, pale and gasping, his body racked with violent illness. He collapsed into bed, his cries of agony waking his landlord. His stomach churned, his skin turned clammy, and he begged for water he could not keep down. The pain came in waves, leaving him doubled over, clawing at his abdomen. Doctors were called, but their remedies were powerless. Laudanum, opiates, small draughts of water, nothing eased his torment. He cried out that he was dying, that poison was burning him alive from the inside. Madeleine, Madeleine? He whispered, the name slipping from his lips in delirium. By morning, Pierre Emile L'Angelier was dead. He was just 33 years old. The cause of death was soon clear to the physicians who examined him. Arsenic poisoning. His stomach was inflamed, his intestines scarred by the unmistakable signs of the deadly substance. The poison that had lurked in whispers and suspicions was now undeniable. Word spread quickly. A young foreign clerk, dead of poison. A wealthy young woman, rumored to have purchased arsenic in the weeks prior. Love letters, dozens of them, found among his belongings, filled with her handwriting, her declarations, her promises. It was a story too salacious, too scandalous for Glasgow society to contain. Within days, it would explode into headlines across Britain. For Madeleine, the morning after his death was the beginning of a nightmare. The chemist's registers bore her name, the letters bound her to him, and the whispers that had long circulated in drawing rooms now became accusations. She, the daughter of a respected architect, a young lady of society, was suddenly the prime suspect in a murder that would grip the nation. The morning after Emile's death, the city stirred with rumor. Word spread swiftly among clerks, merchants, and drawing rooms that a young man had died in agony, his cries of poison echoing into the night. The landlord of his lodgings had summoned doctors, but their efforts had failed. Within hours, whispers began to circulate that his death was no accident. The police were summoned. They moved quickly, searching Emile's rooms for any clue as to what had struck him down. What they found stunned them. A cache of letters, tied neatly with ribbon, written in a young woman's delicate hand. Hundreds of them, intimate, confessional, brimming with passion and promises. And on their envelopes, a name repeated over and over: Madeleine Hamilton Smith. The letters were a revelation. In them, Madeleine spoke not only of love but of surrender, of giving herself to Emile body and soul, of calling herself his wife in spirit, of yearning for nights together. In a Victorian society where a young woman's virtue was her currency, these words were more damning than any physical evidence. They revealed not just an affair but a transgression that, if made public, could ruin her entirely. As investigators sifted through the letters, another discovery sealed the path forward: the chemist's registers. In the weeks leading up to Emile's death, Madeleine's name appeared several times, each entry tied to purchases of arsenic. She had signed for them herself, explaining they were for vermin control. The dates aligned uncomfortably with the timing of Emile's mysterious illnesses. The pieces began to fit together with startling clarity. A young man dead of arsenic poisoning, a lover who had purchased arsenic in secret, letters binding her to him, filled with passion and confession. To the police, it was a puzzle that arranged itself almost too neatly. Madeleine was questioned. At first, she admitted little. Yes, she knew Emile. Yes, she had written him letters. But when confronted with the full extent of the correspondence, and with the chemist's ledgers, her answers faltered. She denied giving him poison. She insisted that her purchases were for cosmetic use, to improve her complexion, as some women of the time whispered was possible in small doses. She claimed she had not seen him on the night of his death. Her composure impressed some, but to the police it was not enough. The case was too sensational, the evidence too suggestive. They pressed forward, and soon the story burst into the public eye. The newspapers seized upon it with relish. A beautiful young woman of society, accused of poisoning her lover with arsenic. It was a story too delicious to ignore. Columns filled with speculation, with lurid details from the letters, with portraits of the handsome clerk and the high-born daughter. The case became not just a local scandal but a national obsession. In parlors and pubs alike, people argued. Was Madeleine a heartless murderess, silencing her lover to preserve her reputation? Or was she a victim of a man who had entrapped her with letters and threats, driven by desperation rather than malice? The Smith family, once a picture of respectability, found themselves besieged by scrutiny. James Smith, proud and ambitious, saw his reputation threatened, his daughter dragged into a public scandal that could undo years of careful social climbing. For Madeleine, the shame was unbearable. Every letter she had ever written, every promise, every intimate word, was now fodder for strangers to dissect. But scandal was only the beginning. Formal charges loomed. The Crown would bring the case to trial, and Madeleine Hamilton Smith would stand in the dock accused of murder. The world she had known, of drawing rooms and suitors, of dances and opera, was gone. In its place was a new, harsher stage. The courtroom, where her life itself would hang in the balance. In the days following Emile L'Angelier's death, Glasgow simmered with speculation. The young clerk's sudden demise, his whispers of poison, the cache of letters written by a woman of high standing. It was the sort of scandal that society both condemned and secretly craved. The police wasted no time. They gathered testimony from Emile's friends, men who repeated his suspicions that Madeleine had given him poison. They collected the chemist's ledgers, where her name appeared again and again beside purchases of arsenic. They examined his stomach, the inflammation and crystalline deposits, leaving little doubt that arsenic had killed him. Piece by piece, they built a case that pointed directly to Madeleine Hamilton Smith. Her family's townhouse became a fortress of tension. Behind the heavy curtains of Blythswood Square, James Smith raged at the intrusion into his home. To him, the entire affair was an outrage. Not merely the possibility of his daughter's guilt, but the humiliation of seeing his family name dragged through the papers. He had clawed his way up the social ladder, built his fortune and reputation stone by stone, and now everything risked collapse because of Madeleine's indiscretion. Her mother, delicate and nervous, was nearly undone by the strain. Sisters whispered in fear, servants spoke in hushed tones. The house that had once been a symbol of success was now heavy with dread. Madeleine herself moved between defiance and despair. When first accused, she denied everything outright. She had not poisoned Emile, she insisted. Yes, she had purchased arsenic, but only for her complexion. Women did so, she reminded them. It was not unheard of. Yes, she had written him letters, but that did not make her a murderess. She swore she had not seen him on the night he died. But her words rang hollow against the mountain of circumstance. To the authorities, the picture was too stark to ignore. Arsenic purchased, arsenic administered, a lover dead, and the lover's letters binding her to him. It was, as one officer put it, a case as clear as the writing in her own hand. The newspapers fanned the flames. Every detail of her letters was picked apart. Her most intimate phrases splashed across front pages. "I am yours only," one read, and the public gasped at such frankness from a young woman of her class. Editorials painted her alternately as a heartless seductress and a pitiable victim, ensnared by passion and fear. In coffeehouses and taverns, people argued over her guilt. Was she a calculating murderess, determined to rid herself of an inconvenient lover so she could marry another? Or was she a desperate girl, trapped by threats and blackmail, whose only crime was recklessness? The Crown prepared its case with relish. They would present the chemist's records, the testimony of Emile's friends, the medical findings, and most damning of all, the letters themselves. The love story would be turned inside out, its intimacy laid bare before the cold eyes of a courtroom. Madeleine was arrested formally and charged with murder. The spectacle was set. A young woman of high society, on trial not only for her life but for her reputation, her family's honor, and the fragile line between passion and propriety in Victorian Britain. And the public could not look away. By April 1857, the case of Madeleine Hamilton Smith had swelled into a national obsession. In Glasgow, crowds gathered outside the Smith townhouse, craning their necks for a glimpse of the young woman at the center of it all. In Edinburgh, lawyers debated the legal precedents over glasses of claret. In London, newspapers dispatched correspondents north to cover what was already being dubbed the trial of the century. The indictment was delivered with formality and severity. Madeleine Hamilton Smith was charged with the willful murder of Pierre Emile L'Angelier by the administration of arsenic. If convicted, the penalty was clear and merciless: death by hanging. The charge alone was enough to electrify the public. A young lady, not a servant nor a criminal from the city's underbelly, but the daughter of a respected architect, accused of the most heinous of crimes. It was a direct affront to the Victorian ideal of womanhood, that of purity, obedience, and domestic virtue. To imagine such a woman purchasing poison, luring her lover to secret meetings, and watching him die in agony. It was both horrifying and irresistibly fascinating. For the Crown, the case seemed strong. They would call chemists who had sold her arsenic, each with her name neatly inscribed in their ledgers. They would call doctors who had examined Emile's body, their testimony confirming arsenic as the cause of death. They would summon Emile's friends, who would recall his suspicions, his cries of poison, his mutterings of Madeleine's name in his final hours. And, most devastating of all, they would introduce the letters, a young woman's private passion turned into public indictment. But the defense was not without weapons of its own. Scotland's legal tradition allowed for a third verdict beyond guilty and not guilty, not proven. This curious outcome, unique to Scots law, meant the jury might conclude that while suspicion was strong, certainty was lacking. It was, in effect, an escape hatch, and Madeleine's lawyers would aim for it. They prepared to argue that her purchases of arsenic were innocent, consistent with cosmetic use. They would suggest that Emile's own handling of dangerous substances, his vanity, and even his talk of self-medicating could account for the poison in his body. And they would remind the jury, again and again, that the evidence was circumstantial. There had been no eyewitness, no hands seen dropping poison into food or drink. Suspicion alone was not enough to hang a young woman. The Smith family, meanwhile, lived in a kind of suspended dread. James Smith hired the best counsel he could secure, sparing no expense to shield his daughter. But the whispers in Glasgow society were merciless. Some families cut ties entirely, refusing to visit the Smiths' home or acknowledge them in public. Others watched with morbid curiosity, eager to see whether wealth and influence could truly protect a woman accused of so terrible a crime. Madeleine herself was kept largely out of public view. Reports of her demeanor varied wildly. Some said she remained calm and composed, others that she was pale, trembling, nearly undone by the weight of it all. What no one doubted was that she faced the most terrifying prospect imaginable. At 19 years old, she was staring down a courtroom packed with strangers eager to dissect her most intimate secrets, her words, her actions, her very character. And in the background, the press fanned the flames higher still. Caricatures of her appeared in broadsheets, sensational sketches of her beauty paired with lurid headlines. Articles speculated not only on her guilt but on her state of mind, her morals, her soul. To the reading public, she was no longer simply a young woman. She was a symbol, a cautionary tale, a spectacle. By the time the trial opened in July 1857, anticipation reached fever pitch. Crowds camped outside the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh, jostling for seats in the galleries. The courtroom itself was arranged like a theater, with benches packed, eyes fixed on the dock where Madeleine Hamilton Smith would sit, her fate in the balance. What had begun as a secret affair in gaslit streets was now the greatest scandal of its age. And as the trial began, the question echoed through every chamber, every street, every drawing room. Was she guilty? The High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh had seen its share of notorious cases, but never anything quite like this. On the morning of July 9, 1857, the Grand Hall was packed to suffocation. Ladies in bonnets, gentlemen in frock coats, journalists with sharpened pencils, all jostled for space in the galleries. The air buzzed with a feverish mixture of scandal and expectation. Outside, a restless crowd gathered, craning their necks for a glimpse of the accused. Street vendors hawked pamphlets promising the true story of Miss Smith and her poisoned lover. Carriages clattered on the cobblestones as spectators from as far as London and Manchester descended on the Scottish capital. The trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a theater of morality, society, and lurid fascination. And at the center of it all sat Madeleine Hamilton Smith, pale but composed, in the dock. Her dark hair was neatly arranged, her gown modest but elegant. She kept her eyes forward, her hands folded in her lap. Some observers noted the faint lift of her chin, as though defying the weight of every gaze upon her. Others claimed to see fear in her stillness, the trembling restraint of a young woman who knew her life hung by a thread. The Lord Advocate, representing the Crown, rose to present the indictment. His voice echoed in the chamber. Madeleine Hamilton Smith stood accused of the willful murder of Pierre Emile L'Angelier by administering arsenic with malice aforethought on multiple occasions, culminating in his death on the night of March 22, 1857. The penalty, if proven, was death. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out the skeleton of its case. First came the chemists. One after another, they testified to selling arsenic to Madeleine in the weeks before Emile's death. They produced their ledgers, pages turned for the jury to see, her name neatly written in her own hand. The law required purchasers to sign, and there it was, undeniable proof that she had obtained the poison. Then came the doctors. They described in clinical but chilling detail the state of Emile's body. The inflamed stomach lining, the crystalline residues unmistakable as arsenic. Their testimony was blunt. The cause of death, beyond all reasonable doubt, was poison. But it was the letters that transfixed the court. At the prosecution's request, bundles of ribbon-tied papers were brought forth. These were the private correspondences recovered from Emile's lodgings, hundreds of them, written in Madeleine's delicate script. One by one they were read aloud. The courtroom fell into a hush as words meant for a lover's eyes alone echoed in the chamber. "You are my own, my dearest, my life, my all. I am yours, yours only." Gasps rippled through the galleries. Ladies blushed. Gentlemen leaned forward. Journalists scribbled furiously. Here was not the voice of a demure Victorian maiden but of a young woman inflamed by passion, reckless in her declarations, unabashed in her desire. To the prosecution, the letters were not merely proof of intimacy, they were motive. Here was a woman who had bound herself to a lover beneath her station, only to recoil when another, more suitable suitor appeared. The letters proved the depth of her entanglement. The arsenic proved the means of her escape. Madeleine sat still as her words were laid bare, her reputation stripped before strangers. Some said she flushed crimson, others that her face was white as marble. Whatever she felt, she betrayed little. The performance of composure was her only shield. The Crown pressed on. Witnesses described Emile's sudden illnesses, the timing of his meetings with Madeleine, his own belief that he had been poisoned. His landlord recalled his cries in the night. A friend testified to Emile's final words, "I believe she has done it." Piece by piece, the prosecution wove a narrative of betrayal, passion, and murder, and the jury listened, rapt. The prosecution's case unfolded with the rhythm of a carefully constructed play. Witness after witness was called, each piece of testimony building upon the last, until the narrative was one of almost irresistible clarity. Madeleine had both the motive and the means to kill Emile L'Angelier. A series of Emile's acquaintances were brought forward. They spoke of his health in the weeks before his death. The sudden, wrenching bouts of stomach pain that left him doubled over, the vomiting, the weakness, the uncanny recurrence after clandestine meetings with Madeleine. Again and again, they recalled his conviction that he was being poisoned. "If I die," he had told one friend, "it will be by her hand." The court murmured at these words. They carried a grim weight, spoken by a man who could no longer testify for himself, but whose suspicion lingered as a kind of spectral presence in the courtroom. The chemist's ledgers were displayed again, their pages becoming almost talismanic. Each neat inscription of Madeleine's name seemed to burn itself into the minds of jurors and spectators alike. Here was no abstract suggestion but ink on paper, an undeniable link between the accused and the very substance that had destroyed Emile's insides. The Crown advocate drove the point home with ruthless precision. Why had she purchased arsenic 3 separate times, in the weeks immediately before Emile's final illness? Why, if not to administer it to him? Her explanation, that it was for her complexion, was dismissed as absurd, an old wives' tale turned feeble excuse. To the prosecution, the answer was plain. She had tired of her lover, feared exposure, and sought to silence him forever. But it was not only facts and evidence that weighed against her. The letters themselves became a kind of theater, read aloud in a courtroom so still that the scratch of journalists' pens was audible. The jurors shifted in their seats as Madeleine's most intimate words filled the chamber. Her declarations of eternal love, her confessions of physical surrender, her pleas for secrecy. The impact was devastating. In Victorian Scotland, to admit such passion was scandal enough. To write it indelibly in one's own hand was ruinous. Her reputation, the very foundation of her defense, was shredded before the eyes of strangers. Some in the public galleries looked on with pity, whispering that she was but a girl, ensnared by love and threatened by a man who knew how to wield her words against her. Others saw in her a cold-blooded liar, a seductress who had trapped Emile in her net and then destroyed him when he became inconvenient. Outside the court, the newspapers seized every detail. Headlines screamed of the poisoned clerk and the letters of shame. Sketches of Madeleine's pale face appeared in broadsheets from Edinburgh to London. Her beauty was remarked upon as often as her supposed crime, reporters lingering on the contrast between her delicate features and the deadly powder she was accused of using. Inside, the pressure mounted. The prosecution painted her as both victim and villain, a woman reckless enough to give her heart to a man beneath her station, then ruthless enough to poison him when he threatened to expose her. It was a portrait at once sensational and damning, designed not merely to convict her of murder but to strip her of the sympathy that might temper judgment. By the end of the Crown's case, the atmosphere was suffocating. The jurors had heard of arsenic, of illness, of death. They had seen her name in chemists' books, heard her words of passion turned into weapons, and listened to the testimony of a dying man who believed himself betrayed. The stage was set for the defense, and as the prosecution rested, all eyes turned to Madeleine. 19 years old, alone in the dock, her life balanced precariously between rope and reprieve. The prosecution's case had been powerful, but in the Scottish system, the defense was granted full scope to present its counter. And Madeleine's lawyers, a team of some of the most skilled advocates of the day, knew they had one central objective: not to prove her innocence beyond doubt, but to show that the Crown's evidence was circumstantial, incomplete, and insufficient to warrant a hanging. From the moment they rose, the tone shifted. Where the prosecution had thundered about betrayal and poison, the defense spoke with calm deliberation. Their aim was not spectacle, but reason. They began by questioning the very heart of the Crown's case: the chemist's records. Yes, Madeleine had purchased arsenic, they conceded. But was it not common knowledge that arsenic was used in small doses for cosmetic purposes? Were there not countless women in Scotland who had made similar purchases without arousing suspicion? The register entries proved only that she had obtained arsenic, not that she had administered it to Emile. Next, they addressed Emile's own behavior. The defense called witnesses who spoke of his vanity, his delicate health, and his fondness for substances others would never touch. He had spoken often of arsenic, of its supposed benefits, of his tolerance for it. Was it not possible, they suggested, that he had taken it himself, in reckless self-experimentation, or even in some tragic bid for attention? The medical testimony, too, was not beyond question. Arsenic had indeed killed him, but how much, when, and by what hand? The doctors could not say with certainty. Poison left its traces, yes, but it did not reveal who administered it. The defense hammered this point. All the Crown had was suspicion. And then there were the letters. Here the defense tread delicately. They could not deny the words were hers, nor could they erase the scandal. But they urged the jury to see them not as proof of guilt, but as proof of a young woman's folly, of passion written without foresight. They painted Madeleine not as a scheming murderess, but as a girl overwhelmed by her emotions, entrapped by a man who threatened to use her very words as a weapon against her. Is it not clear, one of her lawyers asked the jury, that this young lady was ensnared by a man older, more experienced, more manipulative? That she wrote in the flush of first love words she would later regret? And that, when he threatened her with exposure, she feared ruin? But fear of scandal is not proof of murder. The defense sought to humanize her, to strip away the image of a cold seductress and replace it with one of vulnerability. They described her sheltered upbringing, her strict father, the suffocating expectations placed upon her. Into that world had stepped Emile L'Angelier. Charming, exotic, but unstable, jealous, and threatening. Was it any wonder, they argued, that she felt trapped? But being trapped did not mean she had poisoned him. Madeleine herself, though not called to the stand in her own defense, became the silent centerpiece of their strategy. She sat composed, her youth and fragility on display. Each time her lawyers referred to this young lady, eyes turned to her, and jurors could not help but see not only an accused criminal, but a daughter, scarcely more than a girl, facing the noose. The defense pressed hard on the lack of direct evidence. No witness had seen her administer poison, No food or drink could be traced from her hand to his mouth. No letter confessed intent to kill. Everything rested on inference, on suspicion, on the tragic coincidence of arsenic purchases and Emile's illnesses. In the stern logic of Scottish law, was that enough to condemn her to death? As the defense unfolded, the mood in the courtroom shifted. Where the prosecution had painted a story of passion turned deadly, the defense cast doubt upon each thread of that narrative. And in Scotland, doubt had a name: not proven. The defense strategy now turned toward dismantling the credibility of the Crown's witnesses. One by one, they were recalled and questioned with surgical precision. The chemists, who had testified so firmly about Madeleine's arsenic purchases, were pressed on the details. Could they swear that the white powder sold to her had not been used as she claimed, for cosmetic purposes? Could they deny that other respectable ladies had made similar requests? Reluctantly, each admitted that it was not unusual for women to ask for arsenic under the guise of beauty treatments, or for vermin in a household. The doctors, too, were carefully cornered. Yes, they insisted arsenic had killed Emile, but under cross-examination, they conceded that the timing and dosage could not be pinpointed with certainty. Could the poison have been self-administered, intentionally or otherwise? They could not rule it out. Could arsenic taken over a longer period, even by his own hand, explain the pattern of illness? It was possible, they admitted. The defense seized on these words, possible. Attention then turned to Emile himself. The defense portrayed him not as a tragic victim, but as a man of questionable character. Vain, manipulative, prone to melodrama. Witnesses described his tendency to exaggerate his woes, his previous failed romances, his threats of self-harm. To the defense, he was not a noble young clerk undone by betrayal, but a man who had ensnared a young woman, used her letters as leverage, and perhaps even courted his own destruction. The possibility of suicide was floated not directly, but obliquely. Could it be, they asked the jury, that Emile had dosed himself with arsenic to torment Madeleine, to make her believe she had poisoned him, to force her hand in marriage? It was a shocking suggestion, but in the minds of some jurors, it planted the seed of doubt. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, the press feasted on this reversal. Some newspapers echoed the Crown's outrage, insisting that Madeleine's purchases and Emile's death were too closely aligned to be coincidence. Others took a more sympathetic tone, painting her as a naive girl victimized by an older man's obsession. The debate spilled into parlors and pubs, polarizing society along lines of class, gender, and morality. Back in the courtroom, the defense closed with deliberate calm. They reminded the jury that suspicion was not proof, that circumstance was not certainty. Yes, Madeleine had bought arsenic. Yes, she had written letters that revealed her passion. But the Crown had shown no direct act of poisoning, no witness to her crime, no confession of intent. In the end, they argued what the Crown had built was a story, compelling, sensational, but still a story. And in the solemn gravity of Scottish law, a story was not enough to take a young woman's life. As the defense concluded, all eyes again turned to Madeleine. She sat motionless, her face unreadable, her hands still clasped in her lap. For weeks her words had been shouted across the courtroom, her private life dissected, her every action scrutinized. Now, at last, she had only silence to offer, and her fate would rest on whether silence, and doubt, could save her. By the time the defense rested its case, the trial of Madeleine Hamilton Smith had gripped Scotland, and indeed Britain, with a force few could remember. Every detail had been reported, every phrase dissected. The letters, the arsenic, the dying clerk's suspicions. They were no longer private matters, but national obsessions. On the final day, the courtroom was more crowded than ever. Men queued before dawn for a seat. Women leaned forward from the galleries, eager not to miss a word. The air was thick with anticipation, with the sense that history was being written within those stone walls. The Lord Advocate rose once more, his voice solemn. He urged the jury to look past sympathy, past sentiment, past the distractions of the defense. The facts, he said, were plain. Arsenic had killed Emile. Madeleine had purchased arsenic repeatedly. Emile's illnesses matched the timing of their secret meetings, and she had the strongest motive of all, to rid herself of a lover who threatened to ruin her. "This," he thundered, "is not coincidence. It is calculation. It is not misfortune. It is murder." The words hung in the air. Some in the gallery nodded grimly. Others whispered uneasily. Then came the defense, quiet where the Crown had been forceful, reasoned where the prosecution had been fiery. Their task was not to prove Madeleine innocent beyond all doubt, but to remind the jury of what the Crown had not proved. "Where," they asked, "is the witness who saw her administer poison? Where is the food or drink she placed in his hand? Where is the confession of intent? You have none of these. You have only suspicion. You have only circumstance." They returned to Emile's character, his vanity, his threats, his reckless talk of arsenic. Was it not possible, they suggested, that he had taken poison himself, whether in error or in some desperate attempt to bind her to him? Was it not possible that his fragile health, combined with his obsession, had driven him into folly? The jury, they urged, could not convict on possibility alone. To do so would not be justice, but vengeance. As the speeches ended, the judge addressed the jury. He reminded them of their solemn duty, to weigh the evidence without passion or prejudice. And he reminded them, too, of Scotland's unique verdict. Not only guilty or not guilty, but not proven. If they believed suspicion remained, but certainty was lacking, they could deliver that ambiguous judgment, sparing the accused from the gallows, but leaving the stain of suspicion upon her name. With that, the jury withdrew. The courtroom exhaled. Hours passed. Outside, the crowd swelled, murmuring with impatience. Inside, Madeleine sat motionless, her fate suspended in the hands of 15 men deliberating in silence. The jury's deliberations stretched on through the afternoon. In the courtroom, the crowd whispered restlessly, glancing again and again toward the heavy doors through which the jurors had vanished. Outside, the throngs pressed closer, waiting for word that might seal a young woman's fate. Madeleine sat in the dock, hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable. Some observers swore she was pale as marble, others that her eyes flashed with quiet defiance. The press scribbled every detail of her posture, her gown, even the way she breathed, eager to feed a public ravenous for drama. At last, as the evening shadows lengthened, the jury returned. The chamber fell silent. Every creak of the wooden benches, every shuffle of boots on stone, seemed thunderous in the hush. The foreman stepped forward, holding in his hands the verdicts on the 3 charges. The first charge, that Madeleine Hamilton Smith had murdered Emile L'Angelier by administering arsenic on the night of March 22, 1857. The foreman's voice was steady, "Not proven." A ripple ran through the courtroom. Gasps, whispers, a collective intake of breath. Madeleine sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed ahead. The second charge, that she had administered arsenic on a separate occasion earlier in March. Again, the verdict, "Not proven." Now the murmur grew louder. Some in the gallery looked stunned. Others nodded in satisfaction. Still others muttered in outrage. The third charge, a lesser accusation of earlier attempted poisoning. The verdict, "Not guilty." It was done. Madeleine Hamilton Smith would not hang. She would not even be imprisoned. She was free to leave the dock. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers and jeers alike. Some shouted her name in triumph. Others spat it as a curse. The newspapers rushed to their presses, scrambling to capture the shock of the outcome. Within hours, broadsheets blared the extraordinary result. Not proven. A verdict uniquely Scottish and uniquely maddening. To many, it meant she had escaped on a technicality, spared by clever lawyers though guilt clung to her like a shadow. To others, it meant justice had prevailed, that a young woman had been nearly destroyed by scandal and suspicion, yet saved by the wisdom of the law. Inside the Smith household, relief mingled with humiliation. James Smith had spared no expense in her defense, and his daughter had escaped the gallows. But at what cost? The family name was forever stained. Every whisper in Glasgow society would carry the echo of poison, letters, and shame. And for Madeleine herself, freedom was not truly freedom. Though the law had spared her, society would not. To step outside was to endure the eyes of strangers, the whispers of acquaintances, the judgment of a world that believed her either a murderous unpunished or a reckless girl who had disgraced her family. Still, on that July evening in 1857, as she stepped out of the dock, Madeleine Hamilton Smith was alive. Emile was in his grave, the letters locked away in legal archives, the arsenic scattered into history, and the verdict, not proven, ensured her story would never rest in peace. The day after the verdict, Edinburgh awoke to the clamor of newsboys shouting headlines. The Smith trial concluded. Not proven. The poison case ends in mystery. Papers flew from hand to hand, readers devouring every word of the scandal. Some shook their heads in outrage, convinced justice had been cheated. Others breathed sighs of relief, insisting that a young woman should not have been condemned on suspicion alone. But no one, not a juror, not a lawyer, not even Madeleine herself, could believe her life would simply return to normal. The shadow of the trial followed her everywhere. In Glasgow, the Smith townhouse became a prison of whispers. Neighbors who once called politely at the door now crossed the street to avoid it. Invitations ceased. Acquaintances bowed coolly or not at all. For James Smith, whose reputation had been his life's work, the disgrace was unbearable. His daughter might have escaped the gallows, but she had dragged his family name into every newspaper in Britain. At home, the atmosphere was suffocating. Her mother's fragile nerves grew weaker under the strain. Her sisters lived in the reflected shame of gossip. Her father's anger simmered, sometimes boiling into harsh words. Madeleine herself, once lively and spirited, moved like a ghost through the rooms. She had been spared, yes, but spared only to endure a living sentence of suspicion. Meanwhile, the public fascination only grew. Pamphlets retold the story with lurid embellishments, promising the secret truth of the Smith affair. Books were rushed to print, some condemning her as a poisoner, others romanticizing her as a tragic heroine. In theaters, dramatizations of the trial appeared on stage, actresses playing the role of the pale young woman in the dock, audiences gasping as letters were read aloud. The phrase "not proven" became a kind of curse and a kind of fascination. In Scotland, it had always been controversial, leaving the accused neither guilty nor innocent in the public's eyes. Applied to Madeleine, it seemed to capture the very ambiguity of her case. Was she a clever murderess who had slipped the noose, or a naive girl destroyed by passion and blackmail? The verdict had left the question hanging, and people could not stop asking it. For Madeleine, the verdict meant freedom, but not peace. William Minnick, the respectable suitor once favored by her family, withdrew completely. Their engagement, whispered of before Emile's death, was quietly, firmly broken. No man of standing could risk tying his name to hers. In a society where a woman's worth was measured by reputation, she was effectively ruined. Her father, perhaps seeking to shield what was left of the family, pressed her to leave Glasgow. The city had turned against her. She could not walk its streets without feeling eyes upon her, whispers following her every step. To stay was to live in perpetual disgrace. And so, slowly, she began to consider the unthinkable, leaving Scotland altogether to seek a new life far from the scandal that had defined her. But if she thought the public would forget, she was mistaken. For long after the trial ended, her name remained on every tongue, her story told and retold, her image fixed as both villainess and victim. She was no longer merely Madeleine Hamilton Smith. She was the poison case heroine, the Blythswood Square beauty, the girl with the arsenic letters. Freedom had spared her life, but it had also bound her forever to a story she could never escape. In the weeks after the trial, Madeleine scarcely ventured outdoors. When she did, she felt the burn of 100 eyes upon her. Some looked with pity, others with disgust, but none with indifference. In drawing rooms across Glasgow and Edinburgh, her name was whispered like a scandalous refrain. Madeleine Smith, the poison girl. Her father urged her to maintain a rigid silence. No letters, no explanations, no interviews with the voracious press. Silence, he believed, was their only hope of weathering the storm. But silence did not shield her. It only made her more of a mystery, and mystery fed the gossip. Suitors who had once courted her vanished without a trace. Old friends kept their distance. Families who had once welcomed the Smiths to their tables now turned away. Society, so quick to embrace rising stars, was just as quick to cast down those who fell short of its rigid moral code. At night, alone in her room, Madeleine must have replayed the trial in her mind. The reading of her letters in open court, the gasps of the gallery, the jury foreman's voice delivering not proven. She had been spared the noose, but not the humiliation of exposure. Her innermost feelings had been paraded for strangers. Her words, written in the fire of passion, had become chains that would bind her forever. The Smith family, desperate for escape, looked abroad. America, perhaps, or the continent. Somewhere her name carried less weight, where she might start anew as just another face in a crowd. For a time she lingered in Scotland, but it was no use. Every street, every shop, every whispered laugh reminded her of who she had become in the public eye. Meanwhile, her story took on a life of its own. Pamphleteers embellished the facts, inventing lurid details of secret meetings and midnight poisons. Stage plays dramatized her trial, with actresses declaiming her letters in trembling voices. Newspaper columns debated her innocence long after the verdict, some declaring her guilty beyond doubt, others insisting she was a victim of a man's manipulation and society's cruelty. The phrase Madeleine Smith became shorthand for scandal itself. For years afterward, whenever another young woman was accused of impropriety or a society family was rocked by whispers, her name would be invoked as a warning. Remember what became of Madeleine Smith. Eventually, unable to endure life in Scotland, she left. Under the cover of travel, she slipped away from Glasgow and the heavy shadows of Blythswood Square. Where once she had been the belle of drawing rooms, she was now a wanderer, carrying with her the weight of a trial that had defined her youth. Her departure did not silence the story. If anything, it added to the legend. In her absence, the public imagination grew bolder. Some claimed she had fled to France. Others whispered of America. Still others suggested she had married abroad under a false name. Each rumor only heightened her aura of mystery. And so Madeleine Hamilton Smith entered the next chapter of her life. Not as a free young woman, but as a figure forever branded by scandal, leaving behind a Scotland that could not forgive, and a past that the world refused to forget. When Madeleine Hamilton Smith slipped quietly from Scotland, she left behind not only her family home, but an identity that could never again be free of scandal. She was no longer simply a young woman of Glasgow society. She was the woman from the trial, the poison girl whose name had filled every newspaper in Britain. Her first refuge was London. The great city, sprawling and indifferent, offered a kind of anonymity Scotland could not. Among its teeming streets and endless neighborhoods, one might vanish into the crowd. For a time, Madeleine attempted just that. But London society, though larger, was no less curious. Whispers followed her there as well. Introductions at dinner parties carried awkward pauses when her name was recognized. A sideways glance, a half smile, a too hasty change of subject. These became familiar to her. The past, it seemed, was not so easily shed. Still, she pressed on. In London, she cultivated a quieter existence, retreating from the bright lights of society gatherings and seeking instead the comfort of private circles. She longed, perhaps, for the possibility of marriage, a new name, a new role that might shield her from the ghost of the trial. But respectable men were wary. To marry Madeleine Smith was to invite curiosity, even ridicule. And so, by the 1860s, her gaze turned farther afield. The Atlantic offered a new promise. America, where fortunes were being made, where class was less rigid, where the scandal of Blythswood Square might be forgotten. For many Scots of her generation, emigration was a chance to start again. For Madeleine, it was survival. She crossed the ocean and arrived in America under a veil of discretion. Here, at last, she could reinvent herself. In the great cities of the East, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, she was not instantly recognized. The newspapers there had carried the trial, yes, but the frenzy had not endured in the same way. She could be introduced afresh, her past mentioned only in hushed tones, if at all. For a time, she lived quietly, adopting the manners of a respectable woman, moving in modest circles, never drawing too much attention. But she was never entirely free. Now and again, a curious acquaintance would connect her name to the old trial. A letter from Britain would arrive, filled with half-forgotten scandal. Even abroad, her story clung to her like a scent. Still, America gave her something Scotland and England never could: space. She married, quietly, without fanfare, and built the semblance of an ordinary life. To her neighbors, she was not the infamous young woman of the trial, but simply a wife, later a mother, a figure of domestic steadiness. Yet even as she stitched together this new existence, she carried with her the knowledge that she lived on borrowed ground. The past had not been buried, only displaced. In the archives of Edinburgh, in the pages of old newspapers, in the memory of those who had crowded the courtroom, her story endured. And in her heart, too, the trial could not be erased. She had heard her own words, words written in love, turned into instruments of accusation. She had seen her name tied to arsenic, to blackmail, to death. She had walked free, but only by the narrow grace of not proven. America gave her years, perhaps even decades, of peace. But the legend of Madeleine Hamilton Smith never faded entirely. It hovered over her like a ghost, unseen by those around her, but never absent. In America, Madeleine Hamilton Smith lived under the protective veil of reinvention. The young woman who had once stood in the dock at Edinburgh was now known by another name, her past rarely spoken of, if at all. She became a wife, later a mother, and moved through the rhythms of ordinary domestic life, the raising of children, the running of a household, the quiet rituals of middle-class respectability. Yet beneath the surface, her story never entirely disappeared. From time to time, the embers of her notoriety were stirred. A visiting Scotsman would whisper her name in curiosity. An old clipping, yellowed with age, would surface in a trunk of newspapers carried across the ocean. Occasionally, American papers themselves revived the tale, retelling it as a lurid Victorian drama for readers fascinated by poison and passion. Each time, she must have felt the jolt, the reminder that no matter how many years had passed, no matter how far she had traveled, the trial was still hers to carry. But time has a way of reshaping even the sharpest scandals. As decades passed, and new stories filled the public imagination, Madeleine's case faded into history. For those around her in America, she was not the infamous girl from Glasgow, but simply a neighbor, a hostess, a woman who kept her household in good order. If whispers came, they did so quietly, like the distant echo of a storm long past. She grew older. The lively, impulsive girl of Blythswood Square became a matron, then an elderly woman whose accent still carried the traces of Scotland. In her later years, she lived in New York and then in New Jersey, outwardly unremarkable, inwardly shaped forever by the choices of her youth. It is striking to imagine her in those final decades, reading perhaps of new scandals, new trials, new fallen women in the press, knowing that she too had once been at the center of such storms. Did she think of Emile, of the nights they walked under the gaslight, of the letters she had written in the flush of love? Did she recall the court, the jurors' eyes upon her, the verdict of not proven that had spared her life but defined her forever? Madeleine Hamilton Smith lived to an old age, long enough that her story passed from contemporary scandal into the realm of history. She outlived many who had judged her, many who had whispered her name, many who had filled the galleries of the High Court in Edinburgh. And yet, even as she died quietly in America, the legend endured. In Scotland, her trial remained one of the most infamous in memory. Law students studied it, writers retold it, dramatists found in it endless inspiration. She had sought to escape her past, but she had also become immortal within it. Her life in America was, by all accounts, quiet and respectable. But in the world's eyes, she was never truly free. She was always two women at once: the ordinary wife and mother who lived out her days in anonymity, and the young woman who had once sat in the dock, accused of poisoning her lover with arsenic. It was a duality she carried to her grave. By the time Madeleine Hamilton Smith settled into her quiet life abroad, her trial had already passed into legend. In Scotland, it remained more than just a sensational court case. It was a cultural touchstone, a story people returned to again and again as a symbol of love, betrayal, and the dangerous interplay between passion and respectability. The Victorian age was fascinated by poison. Unlike the brutal violence of knife or pistol, poison carried an air of secrecy, subtlety, and hidden menace. It was the weapon of the domestic sphere, powders slipped into tea, tinctures added to medicine bottles. It was invisible, intimate, and, in the public imagination, uniquely associated with women. The Smith trial seemed to confirm these fears. A young woman, outwardly innocent and refined, accused of wielding arsenic in the shadows of her private life. The public could not resist the paradox. Madeleine was described as beautiful, elegant, and well-bred. Everything a Victorian maiden was meant to be. And yet she was accused of committing the most terrible of crimes, not in a fit of rage but in calculated secrecy. To many, this contradiction was irresistible, the embodiment of society's deepest anxieties about women's hidden power. Writers seized upon it. The case was dramatized on stage, retold in pamphlets, woven into cautionary tales of the dangers of unchecked passion. Caricatures appeared in newspapers, often portraying her as both angel and demon, the delicate face of innocence paired with the deadly hand of poison. For years, theaters across Britain staged plays inspired by her story, audiences flocking to hear actresses recite her letters in trembling tones. But the trial also stirred debates far beyond scandal. Central among them was the peculiar Scottish verdict of not proven. Critics argued that it allowed jurors to shirk responsibility, leaving the accused in a limbo of suspicion rather than delivering clear justice. Supporters claimed it was a necessary safeguard, ensuring that no one could be condemned to death on evidence too weak to prove guilt beyond doubt. In Madeleine's case, the verdict became emblematic of its ambiguity. To some, not proven meant she was guilty but had escaped punishment. To others, it meant the Crown had failed to meet the burden of proof, and she had been rightly spared. Either way, her name became forever linked to that phrase. Even today, discussions of the verdict often circle back to the trial of Madeleine Smith. The gendered dimension of the case also lingered. Victorian commentators fixated on her role as a young woman of society. Was she a victim of a predatory man who blackmailed her, or a cold-blooded schemer who lured him to his death? The trial did not merely weigh her guilt. It dissected her morality, her sexuality, her very character as a woman. In that sense, it reflected broader anxieties of a society that both idolized and feared female agency. Above all, the story endured because it resisted resolution. Unlike cases with clear verdicts, the Smith trial left the central question unanswered. Did she do it? The law had not said yes, but it had not said no either. That ambiguity gave the story its staying power. It invited speculation, interpretation, endless retelling. Every generation could look at the facts anew and draw its own conclusions. By the late Victorian period, Madeleine Smith had become a kind of myth, not just a person but a symbol. Her name was shorthand for scandal, her letters quoted as examples of reckless passion, her verdict a case study in legal ambiguity. She had vanished into private life, but in the public imagination, she lived on. Long after the courtroom had emptied and Madeleine Hamilton Smith had slipped into private life abroad, her trial continued to reverberate through Victorian culture. In the decades following 1857, plays based on her story drew packed audiences. Some dramatizations stayed close to the facts. A young woman in a grand Scottish house, torn between love and family duty, accused of slipping poison into her lover's tea. Others embellished shamelessly, turning her into a villainess in dark gowns or a tragic heroine forced to desperate measures. Audiences thrilled to the spectacle, gasping as actresses read aloud letters of passion, modeled on Madeleine's own. Writers, too, found in her case fertile ground. Penny dreadfuls, those cheap, sensational booklets devoured by working-class readers, retold her story in lurid detail, often with titles like The Poisoned Lover or The Letters of Death. More serious commentators used the case to explore the fragility of Victorian respectability, the tension between appearance and reality. Some even suggested that her trial revealed deeper truths about society's treatment of women, that a man's seductions might be excused, but a woman's passion was judged as a crime in itself. Legal scholars debated the verdict in journals and lecture halls. The not-proven decision, already controversial, gained notoriety as the Madeleine Smith verdict. For critics, it was proof that the Scottish system allowed guilt to go unpunished. For defenders, it was the very essence of justice, the law refusing to condemn where certainty was absent. The ambiguity kept her name alive in the courts long after her figure had vanished from the dock. Even into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, her case was revisited. Journalists wrote retrospectives, asking anew whether justice had been served. Some declared that the evidence against her was overwhelming and that she had slipped free only by clever counsel. Others insisted the Crown had never proven its case, and that she had been the victim, first of Emile's obsessive hold, then of society's relentless judgment. This uncertainty became part of the fascination. Madeleine's story never hardened into a single narrative. Was she a calculating poisoner or a frightened young woman? Was she guilty, innocent, or something in between? The lack of resolution allowed each new generation to reinterpret her, to project their own anxieties and curiosities onto her case. Meanwhile, Madeleine herself lived out her days quietly in America. She did not publish memoirs or defend her name in public. If she read the books and articles written about her, she left no record. Perhaps she preferred it that way. To engage would have been to reopen wounds, to fan the flames of a scandal she had spent decades fleeing. And yet she must have known, she more than anyone, that her name had outlived her presence, that she had become something larger than herself, a legend. By the time she died, well into the 20th century, Madeleine Hamilton Smith was remembered less as a person than as a story of passion, poison, and doubt. Her trial remained one of the great mysteries of Scottish history, taught in law schools, dramatized on stages, whispered about in histories of crime. Her letters, preserved in archives, were still read in hushed tones, their words as vivid as the day she wrote them. Declarations of love that had once bound her to life, then nearly bound her to death. In the end, her legacy was not one of guilt or innocence, but of ambiguity. The not-proven verdict left the central question unanswered, and it was that very uncertainty that ensured her immortality. Madeleine Hamilton Smith would forever remain the young woman in the dock, her fate suspended in the balance, her story unfinished, an enigma that continues to haunt history. In the Victorian imagination, poison was more than just a substance. It was a specter. To the 19th century mind, it was the perfect crime. Invisible, tasteless, able to mimic natural illness, and available in any corner chemist's shop for a few pence. No locked trunk or smuggled pistol was required. A handful of powder, slipped into a teacup or folded into bread, could undo a life in hours. Arsenic was the most notorious of all. Nicknamed the inheritance powder in continental Europe, it was cheap, colorless, and everywhere. It brightened the greens of wallpapers and fabrics, gave cosmetics a pearly sheen, kept vermin at bay, and was whispered about as a beauty aid for women seeking pale complexions. At the same time, it left unmistakable signs in the body of the poisoned: burning pain, vomiting, diarrhea, the slow corrosion of the stomach. It killed not swiftly, like a bullet, but agonizingly, like fire smoldering inside the gut. The paradox fascinated Victorians. Here was a substance both ordinary and deadly, domestic and dangerous. And because it was so often associated with the household, with cleaning, beautifying, tending, suspicion frequently fell upon women. Indeed, the stereotype of the female poisoner became a cultural archetype in the 19th century. Newspapers and novels alike painted portraits of women who, denied power in the public sphere, turned to subtlety and secrecy in the private one. A pistol was a man's weapon, but a packet of powder, that, the public believed, belonged in a woman's hand. Scotland, England, and across Europe, the century produced no shortage of poison scandals. Mary and Cotton in England, later convicted of poisoning multiple husbands and children with arsenic. Catherine Wilson hanged for similar crimes. In France, the affaire Lafarge transfixed the public when Marie Lafarge was accused of killing her husband with arsenic-laced cake. Each case combined domestic intimacy with deadly betrayal, reinforcing the sinister idea of women as natural poisoners. Against this backdrop, the trial of Madeleine Smith struck an especially raw chord. Unlike working-class poisoners who killed for insurance payouts or inheritance money, Madeleine was from the middle class, educated, refined, the daughter of a rising architect. She did not fit the mold of the desperate schemer. She was young, beautiful, from a respectable family, and that made the accusation even more scandalous. If she had wielded poison, it was not for money but for freedom, to silence a lover who threatened her reputation. This narrative was far more shocking to Victorians. It suggested that even in the well-appointed drawing rooms of respectable homes, beneath layers of lace and propriety, lurked the same darkness that newspapers ascribed to servants and paupers. The press emphasized this relentlessly. Sketches showed her elegant profile alongside bottles labeled arsenic. Headlines married beauty and death in the same breath. The trial was framed as a morality play, a reminder that beneath refinement might lie corruption, and that no class was immune from scandal. Madeleine's trial therefore stood out not just because of its ambiguity, but because it blurred the boundaries of the archetype. She was not a hardened serial killer like Mary and Cotton, nor a tragic, impoverished woman driven by desperation. She was a socialite, a young lady with prospects, whose alleged weapon was not rage but calculation. To Victorians, this combination was both alluring and terrifying. The Victorian fixation on poison trials revealed more than fear of the substance itself. It exposed society's unease about women's roles and hidden power. Unlike overt violence, the thrust of a knife, the crack of a pistol, poison was invisible, intimate, secret. It required patience and calculation rather than brute force. And so, in the public imagination, it was coded as feminine. The angel in the house could, with a flick of her hand at the tea table, become the angel of death. This possibility both horrified and fascinated Victorians, who lived in a culture that placed women on pedestals while simultaneously fearing their influence. Madeleine's case epitomized this tension. She was not the impoverished housewife murdering for insurance money, nor the serial poisoner working her way through children and husbands. She was a young lady of standing, well-educated, well-dressed, surrounded by refinement. If she could be suspected of such a crime, then the boundaries between innocence and guilt, purity and corruption, seemed frighteningly unstable. It is no accident that the press lingered so heavily on her beauty. Sketches emphasized her delicate features, her graceful bearing in the dock. Journalists juxtaposed these descriptions with the gruesome accounts of arsenic's effects on Emile's body. The contrast heightened the drama. How could such hands write tender letters, yet also purchase poison? The paradox was irresistible. In literature, too, the archetype of the female poisoner flourished. Penny Dreadful spun lurid tales of women who concealed vials of arsenic in jeweled lockets. More serious authors, even Charles Dickens in his journalism, reflected on the cultural fear of hidden crimes within the home. Plays took inspiration directly from Madeleine's trial, turning her into a character who was sometimes villainous, sometimes victim, but always compelling. And yet, Madeleine stood apart from the stereotype in crucial ways. Unlike Mary and Cotton or Catherine Wilson, there was no evidence of greed. She did not seek money or inheritance. Her alleged motive was reputation, the desperate desire to escape blackmail and secure her family's approval through a respectable marriage. In that sense, her story resonated deeply with middle and upper-class audiences. She was not other. She was one of them. Her fall was more terrifying because it suggested that even good families might harbor scandal and crime. The ambiguity of her verdict added to this resonance. Had she been found guilty and executed, she might have joined the grim pantheon of poisoners, remembered with certainty as a murderess. Had she been acquitted outright, her story might have faded into sympathy and obscurity. But not proven left her suspended between innocence and guilt. And in that suspension, She became emblematic of the era's ambivalence, the fascination with women as both moral guardians and dangerous enigmas. For years afterward, commentators returned to her trial not merely as a matter of law but as a parable. It was cited in sermons, in essays about morality, in debates about the education and independence of women. If young women were given too much freedom, some warned, they might follow Madeleine's path. Passion unbridled, ending in ruin. Others used her case to argue the opposite, that society's suffocating control of women left them desperate, without escape, driven to extremes. Thus her story became more than a true crime. It became a mirror in which Victorians saw their anxieties about gender, power, and secrecy reflected. And as the 19th century rolled on, her name remained shorthand for all of it. Madeleine Smith, the poison girl, the enigma, the verdict that refused to decide. The words that spared Madeleine Hamilton Smith's life were not guilty, but not proven. This singular verdict, peculiar to Scots law, had existed for centuries, but her case propelled it into the spotlight as never before. The origins of not proven lie deep in Scottish legal tradition. Unlike in England, where juries delivered a binary verdict of guilty or not guilty, Scotland allowed for 3 possible outcomes. A jury could declare an accused guilty, acquit them outright as not guilty, or declare that while guilt had not been proven, innocence was not established either. The result was freedom, but freedom under a cloud of suspicion. For centuries, the verdict had existed quietly, used occasionally in cases where evidence was murky. But after 1857, it became infamous as the Madeleine Smith verdict. Critics railed against it. In newspapers and in Parliament, commentators argued that the law had failed to deliver clarity. If she is guilty, she should have hanged, one outraged voice wrote. And if she is innocent, she should have been acquitted. But to say not proven is to punish without punishing, to leave a stain that time itself cannot wash away. Supporters countered that the very ambiguity was its virtue. Better, they argued, to spare a life where certainty was lacking than to condemn on suspicion alone. The law demanded proof beyond reasonable doubt. Where that proof was absent, not proven was the safeguard. In Madeleine's case, they insisted the Crown had failed to provide direct evidence. The jury, bound by conscience, had done the only just thing. Yet, for the public, ambiguity was agony. The question, did she do it, remained unresolved. Her release under not proven ensured the debate would never rest. She was free, but not exonerated. Her name cleared of no charge, her reputation forever marked. The trial made the verdict a subject of lasting controversy. In legal circles, her case became the textbook example. Law students dissected it as a study in circumstantial evidence, in prosecutorial overreach, and in the peculiar burden carried by juries in Scotland. In political circles, it spurred calls for reform, though the verdict survived unchanged. And in the public imagination, it cemented the association. Whenever not proven was debated, Madeleine Smith's name was invoked. Her case also highlighted the unique cruelty of the verdict. Though she escaped the gallows, she was never truly acquitted. She walked free into a society that saw her not as innocent but as unpunished. The stigma clung to her for the rest of her life, shaping her exile and her silence. In this way, her trial revealed both the strength and the weakness of Scottish justice, merciful in its refusal to kill on uncertain evidence, but merciless in the social limbo it created. After 1857, the not-proven verdict became inseparable from the name Madeleine Smith. In newspapers, whenever another jury delivered that ambiguous decision, her case was invoked. It had become the most famous example of a person walking free from court, yet never escaping suspicion. Through the later 19th century, several high-profile trials echoed the same dilemma. Murder cases in which evidence was circumstantial, sexual assault cases where proof was contested, thefts and frauds where witnesses contradicted each other. All ended in not-proven verdicts. And each time, critics complained that the law allowed jurors to split the difference, neither committing to guilt nor granting the mercy of full acquittal. Politicians seized on Madeleine's case in their arguments. Reformers pointed to her ruined life as proof that not proven was cruel. She had escaped the gallows, but her name was branded forever. Would it not have been fairer, they asked, to give jurors only the choice of guilty or not guilty, and allow the accused to leave court with their innocence declared? Conservatives, however, argued the opposite. They pointed to her as a success story of the system. If not proven had not existed, jurors might have convicted her out of fear that acquitting her entirely would look like endorsement of her conduct. The middle ground, they claimed, had saved her from a wrongful hanging. The debate grew so fierce that by the early 20th century, the Madeleine Smith verdict was a phrase all its own. Journalists used it as shorthand for cases where the accused walked free but remained tainted. Teachers of Scots law cited it as the classic example of the doctrine's ambiguity. And ordinary Scots, long after her name had faded from the stage and newspapers, still muttered it when juries refused to decide. Even into the 21st century, her case has never disappeared from the discussion. Modern politicians who campaign to abolish not proven often cite her story. They argue that she illustrates the cruelty of the verdict, a woman never convicted, yet never cleared. Others still insist her trial proves the verdict's worth. When guilt is suspected but evidence is lacking, it provides an alternative to either wrongful conviction or uneasy acquittal. Thus, more than a century and a half after her trial, Madeleine Hamilton Smith remains not only a figure of scandal but a figure of law. Her case is taught in classrooms, debated in Parliament, and remembered in every discussion of whether Scotland should abolish or retain its most controversial legal verdict. Her name has become shorthand for ambiguity, her life a reminder that the courtroom can set you free, but not free you from judgment. In the rigid moral landscape of Victorian Britain, no woman's reputation was more fragile than that of the young unmarried daughter of a respectable family. Chastity was her currency, modesty her shield, and obedience her expected role. To stray from this script, even in whispers, even in secret, was to risk social ruin. The trial of Madeleine Hamilton Smith exploded into this cultural atmosphere like a firework. Her letters alone were enough to brand her fallen. Their frank declarations of passion, their admission of intimacy before marriage, shattered every Victorian convention. That they were read aloud in court, before gentlemen and ladies, clergy and press, was nothing short of scandalous. To respectable society, the letters proved not only her imprudence but her moral corruption. A young woman who could write such words was, in their view, capable of anything. If she could break the codes of propriety so openly, was it such a leap to imagine her breaking the sanctity of life itself? For many Victorians, her sexuality and her supposed crime were bound together, each amplifying the other. And yet, there was another current of fascination at work. The very qualities that condemned her also made her irresistible to the public imagination. The letters revealed a woman of passion, daring, and independence. A woman who defied her father's authority, pursued love on her own terms, and expressed desires that most Victorian women were expected to silence. To some, she was not a monster but a heroine, punished not for murder but for breaking free of society's chains. This duality, condemnation, and romanticization defined her image. Sermons thundered that she was an example of female recklessness leading to destruction. Penny dreadfuls painted her as a dangerous enchantress. Yet plays and novels often softened her, casting her as a tragic figure caught in circumstances beyond her control. In some productions, she was innocent, undone by a cruel and jealous lover. In others, she was guilty, but her crime framed as the desperate act of a woman cornered by social convention. For young women of the time, her case was both a warning and a secret thrill. Mothers invoked her name to caution daughters, "Do not write letters you would not see read aloud in court." Yet readers devoured her story in newspapers and penny publications, captivated by the audacity of her words and the drama of her love affair. She was the embodiment of Victorian contradiction, both the fallen woman to be shunned and the daring romantic to be envied. Her story also revealed the sharp double standard of the age. Emile L'Angelier, who had seduced, manipulated, and threatened her, was rarely judged by the same moral standards. His letters, though fewer, were not scrutinized in the same way. His sexual conquest was whispered about with admiration in some circles, while her sexuality was treated as evidence of depravity. She bore the full weight of scandal. He, even in death, was cast more as victim than as transgressor. Thus, the trial became not just a legal drama but a cultural parable. It dramatized the fragility of female reputation, the hypocrisy of gendered morality, and the dangers that lurked when passion clashed with propriety. Madeleine Hamilton Smith became less a person than a symbol of temptation, of rebellion, of the costs of stepping outside the rigid boundaries society imposed on women. In the wake of her trial, Madeleine Hamilton Smith's name was not only whispered in drawing rooms and splashed across newspapers, it was thundered from pulpits. Ministers seized upon her story as a moral warning, weaving her letters and her scandal into sermons about female virtue and male temptation. Congregations were told that her case proved the dangers of unchecked passion, the peril of disobedience, and the ruin that awaited those who strayed from God's path. The fact that she had not been convicted of murder scarcely mattered. To many, the trial had already revealed her guilt of a different kind, guilt of recklessness, of moral weakness, of being a young woman who had dared to love outside her class and write of her desires without shame. For clergymen, this was lesson enough. The road to ruin began not with arsenic, but with a pen and paper, with love letters that betrayed virtue. Parents, especially mothers, took note. Remember Madeleine Smith became a caution whispered to daughters, a reminder to guard their reputations, to never entrust a man with words that could one day be turned against them. In parlors across Scotland, young women were silently measured against her example, a reminder of how quickly innocence could transform into scandal. And yet, even as religion painted her as a cautionary figure, other voices, quieter, but growing stronger as the century went on, reinterpreted her story. Early feminists and social critics saw in her case not just a personal tragedy but a cultural indictment. They asked, why was Emile celebrated for his conquests while Madeleine was destroyed for hers? Why was her passion treated as criminal, while his threats and manipulations were excused? Was she truly guilty of anything more than being a young woman caught in the iron grip of Victorian hypocrisy? These critics did not deny the ambiguity of the poison, but they insisted that, guilty or not, she had been punished in ways no man ever would be, her private life made public, her reputation obliterated, her very words weaponized against her. They saw her not as a monster, but as a victim of a system that demanded female silence and submission. Popular culture, meanwhile, kept her alive in both guises. Penny dreadfuls exaggerated her as a femme fatale, a seductress with arsenic hidden in her bodice. Stage melodramas sometimes softened her, casting her as a tragic heroine undone by love. In both cases, audiences flocked to see her story retold, proof of the fascination she inspired. The paradox of Madeleine Smith became her defining feature. To some, she was a warning. The fallen woman, the poisoner, the danger of female passion ungoverned. To others, she was a symbol of resistance, a young woman who defied her father, pursued love on her own terms, and paid the price for stepping outside her cage. Even today, she resists easy classification. Was she guilty? Was she innocent? Was she a victim, a villain, or both? The verdict of not proven left the question forever unanswered, and that ambiguity continues to haunt her legacy. In the end, Madeleine Smith became something larger than herself, a mirror of Victorian society's deepest anxieties about gender, morality, and desire. She was condemned and romanticized, feared and pitted, forgotten and remembered, always both angel and demon, always an enigma. When Madeleine Hamilton Smith died quietly in America in 1928, she had long since slipped into anonymity in her personal life. Neighbors who knew her in her later years saw only a respectable elderly woman, not the notorious figure who once filled every newspaper in Britain. Yet while her personal world grew smaller and quieter, her story in the public imagination grew larger. By the end of the 19th century, her trial was already regarded as one of the most sensational in Scottish history. Legal handbooks cited it as a classic study of circumstantial evidence. Newspapers, in their 50 Years Ago Today columns, revived her name, reminding readers of the beautiful poisoner of Blythswood Square. Each anniversary of the trial seemed to spark new commentary. The fascination was not limited to lawyers. historians and true crime writers revisited the case again and again. Each retelling tried to answer the question the jury had left hanging. Was she guilty? Some argued forcefully that the evidence pointed to murder. Others insisted the Crown's case had been built on suspicion and prejudice. The ambiguity of not proven ensured that every writer could find room for argument. Novelists, too, were drawn to her story. The image of the passionate young woman, trapped between love and duty, whispering over arsenic-laced tea, became irresistible material. Though often disguised under fictional names, characters inspired by Madeleine appeared in late Victorian and Edwardian fiction, sometimes as cautionary figures, sometimes as tragic heroines. In the 20th century, her story leapt onto the screen. Plays and films dramatized the trial, relishing the tension of the courtroom and the scandal of the letters. Audiences, just as in 1857, gasped at her words read aloud, felt the chill of the chemist's ledgers, and held their breath as the jury delivered not proven. Even when the productions altered details, the heart of the story remained. The young woman accused of poisoning her lover, and the verdict that left her both free and condemned. The persistence of her legend owed much to the very qualities that made it famous in the first place. It had all the ingredients of enduring drama: a secret love affair, passionate letters, poison, a sensational trial, and a verdict that refused to decide. Unlike other cases, where guilt or innocence closed the book, Madeleine's story remained forever open. And so, as the decades passed, she shifted from scandal to history, from whispered warning to cultural icon. She was no longer merely a Glasgow girl in disgrace. She had become one of the great figures of true crime, a name invoked wherever passion, poison, and ambiguity crossed paths. The 20th century only deepened the fascination with Madeleine Hamilton Smith. As true crime emerged as a literary and popular genre, her case appeared again and again in anthologies of famous trials. In Scotland especially, her name was invoked as readily as Burke and Hare, Deacon Brodie, or other notorious figures of crime and scandal. But unlike those, her story was defined not by a verdict of guilt, but by the unsettling ambiguity of not proven. In the 1920s and 1930s, retrospectives cast her as a symbol of Victorian hypocrisy, a young woman destroyed not by arsenic, but by the impossible expectations of her time. By the mid-20th century, dramatizations brought her case to new audiences. Plays staged her letters, with actresses trembling as they read her most intimate words aloud to a gasping public, just as had been done in 1857. The spectacle of her passion made public remained irresistible. Television later revived her trial as well. Documentaries replayed the events with solemn narration, while dramatized series leaned into the suspense of the jury's verdict. Each adaptation tended to leave the central question unresolved, echoing the trial itself. Was she guilty or innocent? The audience, like the jury, was left to decide. Historians continued to return to her case in legal studies and cultural critiques. For some, she exemplified the cruelty of the not-proven verdict, a woman acquitted yet forever marked. For others, she symbolized Victorian double standards: a man's seductions excused, a woman's passion condemned. Feminist scholars, especially in the later 20th century, reclaimed her as a figure caught between desire and repression, a young woman punished not for arsenic, but for daring to love on her own terms. And so her story has remained alive. In books, stage plays, films, and television, Madeleine is still reimagined. Sometimes guilty, sometimes innocent, always compelling. She has become less a historical figure than a mythic one, a character endlessly reshaped to suit the anxieties and fascinations of each new era. What endures most of all is the unresolved nature of her case. Unlike other infamous trials, where guilt was established or innocence vindicated, Madeleine's trial ended in ambiguity. The verdict of not proven left a vacuum that generations have filled with speculation, judgment, and imagination. That ambiguity is her immortality. Madeleine Hamilton Smith lived into old age under another name, in another country, far from the city that once condemned and obsessed over her. But history has refused to let her go. In Scotland, her name remains one of the most famous in the annals of crime. In literature and culture, she endures as the eternal enigma. The beautiful young woman in the dock, the poison in question, the verdict suspended forever between innocence and guilt. In Scotland today, more than 160 years after the trial, the name Madeleine Hamilton Smith still resonates. For many Scots, she is not merely a historical figure but a cultural symbol. At once notorious and tragic, guilty and innocent, forever suspended in the ambiguity of not proven. Museums and archives have kept her case alive. In Glasgow, exhibits on Victorian life often include her trial as a window into the city's past. The respectable townhouse in Blythswood Square, the scandal that erupted behind its polished doors, the courtroom drama that followed. In Edinburgh, legal exhibitions feature facsimiles of her letters, displayed with both fascination and unease. Visitors lean close to read the very words once read aloud to gasping Victorians. Words that condemned her reputation and immortalized her in history. Her story is also a staple of tours and talks. Guides in Glasgow recount the tale of the Blythswood Square poison case, their audiences hanging on every detail of her romance, her trial, her ambiguous acquittal. In Edinburgh, where the High Court of Justiciary still stands, her name is spoken alongside the city's other great trials, her case retold as one of the most dramatic in Scottish legal history. And in the legal world, her trial remains more than a curiosity. It is a reference point. Every time Scotland debates the abolition of the not-proven verdict, Madeleine's case is raised. Critics argue that she was condemned to a lifetime of suspicion, proof of the verdict's cruelty. Defenders reply that she was saved from the gallows precisely because the jury had that third option. More than a century and a half later, her name still carries weight in discussions of justice. Modern true crime culture has also revived her. Documentaries revisit her trial with dramatic reconstructions. Podcasts parse the evidence in forensic detail. Authors retell the story for new generations fascinated by the intersection of love and death. The narrative has everything contemporary audiences crave: passion, scandal, poison, and the eternal mystery of guilt or innocence. What makes her story endure, even now, is not only the sensational elements but the very impossibility of resolution. Unlike modern cases where forensic science can often deliver certainty, Madeleine's trial belongs to an era when medicine was imprecise and evidence largely circumstantial. That uncertainty still haunts her story, allowing each listener, each reader, to make their own judgment. In today's Scotland, she is remembered in two contradictory ways. On the one hand, she is a figure of infamy, her name shorthand for scandal. On the other, she is a historical curiosity, a tragic heroine, a symbol of Victorian hypocrisy. To some, she was a clever poisoner who escaped justice. To others, a victim of a man's obsession and a society's double standards. Either way, she remains unforgettable. Her name is etched not just in law books and archives, but in the imagination of a nation that still debates her guilt, still reenacts her trial, still whispers her letters. Madeleine Hamilton Smith's name still lingers in Scotland, not only in law courts and archives, but in culture, tourism, and art. She has become both a historical figure and a kind of folk legend, the poison girl of Blythswood Square, whose story is retold with each new generation. In Glasgow, walking tours of the city's Victorian heart often pause outside Blythswood Square. Guides gesture toward the elegant facades and invite their listeners to imagine the young Madeleine slipping out of her father's townhouse, letters in her pocket, on her way to meet Emile under cover of darkness. The square, once a symbol of respectability, is forever linked to whispers of scandal and arsenic. In Edinburgh, the courtroom where she once stood is part of legal tours, her case described as one of the most riveting spectacles in the history of the High Court. For visitors, it is almost impossible to stand in that chamber and not picture her in the dock. 19 years old, pale but composed, her future hanging on the ambiguous words not proven. Her story also reappears in novels and plays. Contemporary writers have woven her case into historical fiction, reimagining her inner thoughts, her letters, her courtroom ordeal. Playwrights stage adaptations of her trial, sometimes faithful to the record, sometimes speculative, but always centered on the question that still grips audiences. Did she do it? For modern audiences, the way she is interpreted often differs from Victorian portrayals. Where Victorians saw her letters as proof of depravity, many today see them as a sign of her humanity. A young woman daring to express passion in a world that demanded silence. Where Victorians judged her as reckless and immoral, modern readers often view her as a victim of Emile's manipulation and society's suffocating double standards. Feminist scholars in particular have argued that she was punished not for murder, but for her refusal to conform. Yet the ambiguity of her trial remains central. Each retelling, each documentary, each podcast leaves the question open, allowing audiences to form their own verdict. The enduring power of her story lies in that unresolved tension. A crime that may or may not have been committed, a verdict that declared neither guilt nor innocence, a life lived under a shadow that could never be lifted. Today, she exists at the intersection of history and myth. She is taught in schools as part of Scottish legal history, invoked in debates about not proven, and remembered in popular culture as one of the great enigmas of Victorian Britain. Her face appears in sketches, her words in exhibits, her story in countless retellings. For Scotland, Madeleine Smith remains both a daughter of Glasgow and a ghost of its past. A young woman who stepped outside the rigid confines of her age and found herself immortalized, not in love, but in scandal. And as long as her verdict remains undecided in the minds of those who revisit her story, she will never fade from memory. Madeleine Hamilton Smith was not the first woman to be accused of wielding poison, nor would she be the last. In the 19th century, arsenic seemed to seep into headlines with unnerving regularity, its white grains a silent presence in households and its traces a grim discovery in autopsies. Mary and Cotton, hanged in England in 1873, was convicted of poisoning multiple husbands, children, and stepchildren with arsenic in order to collect insurance money. She became known as Britain's first female serial killer, her crimes shocking in their scale and cold-blooded repetition. Catherine Wilson, executed in 1862, was accused of killing patients under the guise of nursing them, her poisonings hidden in medicines and drafts. On the continent, Marie Lafarge's 1840 trial in France became an international sensation when she was accused of slipping arsenic into her husband's food, with a slice of cake becoming the central piece of evidence. Each of these cases riveted the public, yet their fame dimmed with time. Cotton became a grim entry in the annals of crime, Wilson little more than a name in execution lists, Lafarge remembered mostly by legal historians. Madeleine, by contrast, has never quite faded. Why? Part of the answer lies in her class and background. Cotton and Wilson came from working-class lives, their stories framed as tales of greed and desperation. Madeleine, however, was the daughter of a respected Glasgow architect, raised in wealth and refinement. To Victorian audiences, her fall was far more shocking because it came from within the drawing rooms of respectability. She was not other. She was one of their own, a mirror of middle-class daughters and sisters. Her scandal pierced the illusion of safety that social class was thought to provide. Another reason lies in her age and appearance. At 19, she was young, attractive, and described by reporters in glowing terms. The contrast between her beauty and the horror of poison magnified the drama. The press lingered on her face, her dress, her composure in the dock. Audiences were fascinated by the idea that such a delicate figure could conceal such deadly intent. Most of all, it was the verdict. Cotton, Wilson, and Lafarge were condemned, their guilt publicly declared, their stories sealed with execution. Madeleine was neither convicted nor acquitted. The jury's decision of not proven left her suspended forever in uncertainty. She walked free but not innocent. She was spared but not vindicated. That ambiguity gave her story endless life. Every retelling, from the Victorian penny press to modern documentaries, returns to the same haunting question. Did she do it? And because the answer was never settled, audiences continue to argue, speculate, and imagine. Thus Madeleine stands apart from her contemporaries. She was not the deadliest poisoner, nor the most prolific, but she was the most enduring precisely because her story was never finished. Victorian Britain judged women harshly when it came to crime, but it did not judge them all equally. Class, beauty, and demeanor often shaped public perception as much as evidence. This dynamic helps explain why Madeleine Hamilton Smith's story has endured while other poisoners slipped into footnotes of history. Working-class women accused of poisoning, like Mary and Cotton or Catherine Wilson, were typically portrayed as monsters, greedy, coarse, and heartless. Newspapers described them in stark terms, their crimes framed as the natural product of poverty and depravity. There was little ambiguity in their portrayals. They were condemned by the press before the jury had even spoken. Once convicted and executed, their stories closed with finality. Madeleine, by contrast, belonged to the respectable middle class. She was young, attractive, educated, the daughter of a prosperous architect. Her letters revealed not greed or malice, but passion and vulnerability. Even as the Crown painted her as a murderess, the press described her as beautiful, graceful, composed. She was both condemned and romanticized, her image shaped as much by fascination as by fear. This duality allowed audiences to see her not just as a criminal, but as a character in a melodrama. Some cast her as a seductress, a dangerous femme fatale whose beauty concealed arsenic. Others saw her as a tragic heroine, a young woman undone by love, threatened by a manipulative man, and judged by a society unwilling to forgive her passion. Few poisoners, before or since, occupied both roles so completely. The verdict of not proven sealed this ambiguity. A guilty verdict would have made her infamous, but finite. Another executed poisoner, her story concluded on the scaffold. An acquittal might have restored her to obscurity, her case remembered briefly, then forgotten. But not proven left her permanently in limbo. Neither guilty nor innocent, she became an enigma. Her story could never be closed, only retold. This, more than anything else, explains why her legend endures. Madeleine is not remembered because she was the most prolific or cunning of poisoners. She was neither. She is remembered because her trial left the central question forever unanswered. Each generation projects onto her what it fears or desires. To Victorians, she was a warning against female passion. To later feminists, a symbol of women judged more for their sexuality than their crimes. To modern audiences, a true crime mystery with no solution. Where others were consigned to history as villains, Madeleine became something rarer, a paradox. She was both victim and villain, angel and demon, guilty and innocent. That paradox continues to fascinate because it reflects not only her story, but the contradictions of the society that judged her. And so, while the names of other poisoners fade into dusty records, Madeleine Hamilton Smith endures. The eternal question mark, the woman whose life was defined by the verdict that refused to decide. After the whirlwind of the 1857 trial, Madeleine Hamilton Smith seemed determined to bury her past as deeply as possible. Scotland had branded her forever. Every street in Glasgow carried whispers of arsenic and scandal. To stay was impossible. The only path forward was to disappear. She first retreated to London, living quietly under her own name for a time, but the whispers followed her even there. By the 1860s, she had crossed the Atlantic to the United States, a place vast enough, anonymous enough to allow her a second chance. In America, she shed the name that had filled British newspapers. She lived instead as Lena Wardle Sheehy, the woman she became after marriage. Under this new identity, she built an entirely different life. Not as the infamous poison girl of Blythswood Square, but as a wife and later a mother, in a society that knew little of her past. The contrast could not have been sharper. In Scotland, she was immortalized in caricatures, stage plays, and cautionary sermons. In America, she was a respectable matron who hosted neighbors, attended church, and raised her children. Where once her letters were read aloud to gasping crowds, now her words were spoken only in the quiet of family conversations. She married twice, her first marriage ending in widowhood, her second to a man named William Sheehy, with whom she spent her later years. She bore children, one of whom would live into the mid-20th century, long after the scandal had become history. To them, she was not the figure in the dock but simply mother or grandmother. A woman of ordinary habits, whose past was largely unspoken. Neighbors in New York and New Jersey, where she lived much of her later life, had little reason to suspect her history. She presented herself with dignity, moved in middle-class circles, and rarely spoke of Scotland. For many who knew her, she was simply another immigrant woman, her lilting accent a reminder of faraway Glasgow, but her life firmly American. And yet, the past could not be erased entirely. Occasionally, a newspaper rediscovered her whereabouts, running retrospective pieces that hinted at her quiet existence abroad. The poison trial of 1857 would resurface in sensationalist articles, with speculation about what had become of Madeleine Smith. Some claimed she had died in obscurity, others that she had lived under assumed names. Few realized she was alive and well, reading those very articles from across the ocean. If she felt the sting of recognition, she left no record of it. No memoirs, no public statements, no effort to tell her side of the story. Perhaps she believed silence was her only protection, that the less she spoke, the less chance her American neighbors would learn the truth of who she had been. Thus she lived out her decades in peace, her life divided neatly in two. The young woman who had once stood in a crowded courtroom in Edinburgh, and the elderly matron who now sat quietly on American porches, watching her grandchildren play. By the early 20th century, Madeleine Hamilton Smith was an old woman. To her American neighbors, she was Lena Sheehy, respectable, unremarkable, the widow of William Sheehy, living out her days in relative obscurity in New Jersey. Her Scottish accent marked her as an immigrant, but little else about her hinted at scandal. She lived quietly, surrounded by family. To her children and grandchildren, she was simply mother or grandmother, a woman of routines and recollections of a faraway homeland. She told them little of her youth. If they pressed her about her life in Scotland, she deflected with vague answers. She never once volunteered the story of the trial that had defined her. But across the Atlantic, her name remained alive. In Scotland, her case was still cited in legal texts, still recounted in histories of Glasgow, still whispered about on tours of Blythswood Square. To law students, she was the face of the not-proven verdict. To true crime enthusiasts, she was the beautiful poisoner whose guilt had never been decided. In Britain, she was immortal. In America, she was forgotten. This dual existence was remarkable. Few historical figures managed to live long enough to see themselves transformed into myth. Madeleine did. She lived 70 years beyond the trial, long enough that most of those who had judged her were gone, long enough that her own grandchildren might never have guessed the full truth of who she had once been. She died in 1928 at the age of 92, a long life by any measure, especially for a woman who, at 19, had sat in a dock facing the very real possibility of execution. Her death was quiet, her American obituary brief. It mentioned her family, her respectability, her life as Lena Sheehy. Not a word about the trial that had once captivated a nation. Only later did history stitch her two identities back together. Genealogists, historians, and journalists eventually traced the quiet woman in New Jersey back to the scandalous young lady of Glasgow. In that revelation, the two halves of her life converged. Madeleine Smith, the enigma of Victorian Scotland, and Lena Sheehy, the grandmother who lived in anonymity, were one and the same. For her descendants, the discovery must have been startling. To imagine one's grandmother as the subject of one of the most famous trials in history, accused of poisoning a lover, immortalized in courtrooms, novels, and plays, is to realize how profoundly the past can be hidden in plain sight. Her life thus ended as it had been lived, in contradiction. She was both notorious and anonymous, infamous and invisible. She escaped the gallows, but not her legend. She built a second life, but could never erase the first. And when she died, she left behind more than family and memories. She left behind a mystery that endures, a story that refuses to be resolved, a name that still echoes in law books and walking tours, on stage and screen. Madeleine Hamilton Smith. The story of Madeleine Hamilton Smith is one of the great enigmas of Victorian Britain. It begins in the respectable drawing rooms of Glasgow, with a 19-year-old girl living under the stern gaze of her ambitious father. It spirals into secrecy, as she slips out into the gaslit streets to meet a lover far below her station. It erupts in scandal when that lover dies in agony, arsenic in his body, whispering her name in his final hours. And it climaxes in a courtroom where her letters are read aloud, her purchases exposed, her passion laid bare before a nation. At the end of that trial, the words not proven spared her life, but they did not set her free. For the rest of her days, she lived in the shadow of that verdict. In Scotland, she became legend, the poison girl, the woman whose guilt or innocence would never be resolved. In America, she lived as Lena Sheehy, wife and mother, her past concealed, her neighbors never knowing they shared their streets with one of the most infamous women of the Victorian age. Few lives are divided so starkly. Few stories balance so perfectly between condemnation and sympathy, guilt and innocence, villainy and tragedy. Madeleine's is not the tale of a serial poisoner like Mary and Cotton, nor the clean arc of a wrongly accused woman vindicated by history. Instead, it is a story that refuses resolution, and that refusal is what has kept it alive. Her case reveals much about the world in which she lived. It shows the fragility of female reputation in Victorian Britain, where a young woman's passion could ruin her as surely as any crime. It exposes the double standard that judged Emile's seductions lightly while condemning her desire as depravity. It demonstrates the power of the press, which transformed private letters into public spectacle, and of the law, which created an outcome as ambiguous as her story itself. And it reminds us of society's endless fascination with poison, the invisible killer, the weapon associated with secrecy, with the home, with women. Madeleine became the embodiment of that fear. A beautiful young woman who, some believed, carried death in her hand as easily as a letter. Madeleine Hamilton Smith's legacy lives on not because of certainty, but because of doubt. Most true crime stories end with closure, a conviction, an execution, or an acquittal. Hers ended with ambiguity. The jury said only that her guilt had not been proven. That gap, that silence, left room for speculation, for retelling, for myth. In the years since, her name has come to stand for more than her own life. In law, she remains the prime example whenever Scotland debates the not-proven verdict. Her trial a case study in the fine balance between mercy and cruelty. To critics, her life shows the unfairness of leaving an accused person in limbo. To defenders, her survival proves the verdict's value. Even today, her case is invoked in parliamentary debates on whether the verdict should be abolished. In culture, she endures as one of the most fascinating figures of Victorian scandal. Her story has been retold in novels, plays, films, and television. Sometimes she is guilty, a femme fatale with arsenic in her hand. Sometimes she is innocent, a tragic heroine destroyed by passion and prejudice. Always she is compelling. The ambiguity allows each generation to remake her in its own image. In gender history, her case illustrates the fragility of women's reputations in the 19th century. Her letters, words of love written in private, became the central evidence against her. Her passion, more than the poison, defined her trial. She was judged not only for what she may have done, but for what she had dared to feel and to write. For modern readers, this is perhaps the most haunting aspect of her story, that her crime, in the eyes of Victorian society, began with love. Her personal legacy is equally paradoxical. She lived to 92, a quiet matron in America, her neighbors never suspecting her past. She raised children, attended church, and died respected in her community. Yet in Scotland, she never escaped her youthful infamy. She was both the grandmother in New Jersey and the eternal figure in the dock at Edinburgh. Two lives that coexisted uneasily until history reunited them. And so we are left, as the jury was in 1857, with the same haunting question. Did she do it? Did Madeleine Hamilton Smith slip arsenic into Emile L'Angelier's cocoa? Or did he take it himself, a victim of vanity or despair? The evidence will never answer. The verdict will never change. What remains is the power of the story. It is the story of a young woman caught between passion and propriety, between private desire and public judgment. It is the story of a trial that laid bare the hypocrisies of Victorian morality. And it is the story of ambiguity, the kind that refuses to die, that keeps people arguing, keeps writers writing, keeps audiences leaning forward in fascination more than a century and a half later. Madeleine Hamilton Smith will always be two things at once: guilty and innocent, villainous and victim, forgotten and immortal. And perhaps that is the truest verdict of all.